Chapter 168. Clown Potion Phew. I finally passed. I passed it just like that. When Klein heard Christette Sesamir's announcement, he let out a breath of relief despite being mentally prepared for it. It felt surreal, as though it was a dream. He had assumed that the examination would be tougher and lengthier, but when he thought carefully about it, he realized that what had just happened was what should have happened. If he had taken the normal 3 years to digest the seer potion instead of doing it in a month, the examination wouldn't have even been conducted by the Holy Cathedral. The Tinjin Nighthawk's captain would have been responsible for it instead. I thought they would investigate my family and friends. Perhaps Sesamir arrived in Tinjin 2 days ago and completed that in secret. I also thought that the examination would require me to complete some task. I was really overthinking it. The goal of the examination is merely to determine the level of digestion for the potion, as well as detect any latent dangers, and see whether I'm aware of the acting method, and if I shared my experience with others. These thoughts flew past Klein's mind. He flashed a sincere smile. Thank you, Your Grace. Praise the lady. Christette nodded gently and said, To advance is to serve the goddess better, so that you can protect our fellow believers better. You must remember this. Trust me. It'll help you fight the temptation of losing control. Temptation. Klein ruminated over the word. Christette sized Klein up with his green eyes and said sternly, The acting method can help you digest the potion and lower the risk of losing control, but it's not the be-all and end-all. To a certain extent, you can even confuse playing the role and your own existence. You know, there are many actors in the theater that develop severe psychological issues. At a certain level you might really go insane. Remember that you're only acting. The only point of note concluded by the City of Silver is identical to what Deacon Sesamir said. Klein nodded thoughtfully in agreement. In addition, Christette emphasized, not only is losing control related to the potion, it's also closely related to your emotions and mental health. The most important thing for a Beyonder is to control yourself. Only then will you be able to withstand the temptations of evil gods and devils, resisting emotions like greed and jealousy, and the erosion of desire. Of course, I don't mean that you should get rid of all your emotions and desires, because that is something that no human or even demigod can do. Yes, perhaps only some special sequences are able to achieve that sort of state. Klein suddenly thought about old Neil. He couldn't help but ask in reply, We must keep our emotions and desires at a reasonable level, and not allowing them to drive us to do something irrational and abnormal? Christette nodded solemnly. Yes. After he answered, there were wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. That's all I wanted to warn you about. Now, I'll pass you the clown potion formula and the relevant ingredients. He bent down and put his silver suitcase on the long table. He then turned around and moved a few steps, blocking Klein's view. When the surrounding lights strangely vanished again, Klein suddenly understood that the formula and ingredients were in the suitcase that stored the holy artifact. It was simply because his gaze was attracted by the pure white bone sword, which was why he didn't notice, or perhaps he couldn't notice, the other items in the suitcase. After a few minutes, the light of the gas lamps lit up the alchemy room again. Christette picked up his suitcase and moved away, presenting the items on the long table to Klein. Among them, the most eye-catching item was the palm-sized gray goat horn. It looked like a miniature version of a normal goat horn and was crystal clear, swirling with colors. There were faint layers of unique patterns. Next to the goat horn was a blue rose. There were red veins on the petals that connecting them together. It seemed to form a human face with a smile. Ha ha ha, woo woo woo, ha ha ha, woo woo woo. Klein heard illusory laughter and crying diffused with each other, and he saw pieces of gray halos floating in midair. A crystal of the single horn of a matured Hornaceous gray mountain goat, and a complete stalk of a human-faced rose. The main ingredients of the clown potion. He nodded indiscernibly and took a few steps towards the long table. 80 milliliters of pure water, 5 drops of torn apple juice, 7 grams of black-rimmed sunflower powder, 10 grams of golden cloak grass powder, 3 drops of poison hemlock. Klein looked at the unfurled goatskin parchment and compared the written content with the formula that he had memorized. After he confirmed that there was nothing wrong, he recalled the demonstration old Neil did. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly to collect his emotions. With the apparatus in the alchemy room, he distilled some pure water needed by the potion. In the potion formula, pure water referred to water that was distilled over and over again. Then, he washed a black metal pot and threw in the supplementary ingredients one after another. He was as skillful as back when he had done chemistry experiments in high school. As the Beyonder ingredients hadn't catalyzed just yet, He didn't see any obvious changes in the liquid in the metal pot. At most, he only saw powder floating on the surface of the liquid. When he was done with the preparations, Klein cast his gaze at the two main ingredients and gratefully thought, "There's no description of the exact size or weight of the required gray mountain goat single horn crystal or the human-faced rose. Perhaps a whole horn and a complete rose have no differences, regardless of their weight, allowing them to meet the requirements. Yes, in the world of mysterious beyonders, this is definitely possible. If so, I don't have to worry about putting in excessive amounts of the main ingredients." After a few seconds, Klein picked up the human-faced rose and threw it into the metal pot. When the strange flower touched the liquid, it immediately produced a sizzling sound. The surrounding illusory laughter became shrill. Ha 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 ha. Klein didn't delay any further as he immediately grabbed the crystalline mountain goat horn and threw it into the metal pot. Poof! The terrifying laughter disappeared all of a sudden, and the surrounding gray halos slowly converged into the metal pot. Klein lowered his head and saw the liquid in the pot was colored in a mix of gold, yellow, and red. However, the three colors remained extremely distinct at their boundaries. There were bubbles churning and fizzing from the liquid, but they failed to escape from the pot and ended up bursting silently. The scene reminded Klein of Sprite, the carbonated drink from his previous incarnation. This actually looks like a delicious drink. A thought popped into his head that aligned with the characteristics of his culture. Suppressing his nervousness, excitement, and anticipation, Klein poured the liquid from the black metal pot into a glass bottle. What shocked him was that there wasn't a single bit of the potion left in the metal pot. It really is a potion that turns people into beyonders. Klein raised his right hand, and he looked at the beautiful-looking tri-colored liquid. Christette Sesamir, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly smiled and said, "Don't worry. At the very least, I didn't notice any problems with the concoction of your potion. I've been waiting here to ensure that no accidents happen after you consume the potion. Don't worry, as long as it isn't anything serious, I should be able to save you." "Okay." Klein nodded and placed the clown potion back onto the long table. Then he took off the silver chain inside his sleeve and let the topaz pendant hang down naturally, a slight distance above the liquid. To beyonders of any other occupation, pendulum divinations could only divine a yes or no answer. Of course, when there wasn't enough information, the divination wouldn't yield any useful answers at all. When the pendulum didn't spin, it was called a failed divination. As a seer, Klein's pendulum could also vaguely determine the degree of the yes or no answer. Klein's eyes grew dark as he recited, "This potion is harmful. This potion is harmful." 7 times later, he opened his half-closed eyes and saw the topaz pendant spinning clockwise, but very slowly. Clockwise means a positive response. In other words, it means that the potion is harmful. However, it spins slowly, which means that it's only slightly harmful. Yes, potions can bring about a loss of control, so there's the possibility of harm. A low level of harm means there is nothing wrong with the potion. Klein let out a breath of relief and wound the pendulum on his left wrist before covering it with his sleeve. At that moment, Christette couldn't help but sigh. "You really are a professional seer." "I must fully utilize my advantage, but I can't rely on it too much and think that it's all-powerful," Klein replied softly and took up the clown potion bottle. "After drinking it, I'll become a Sequence 8 Beyonder." The thought flashed in his mind and Klein didn't hesitate. He raised the bottle, tipped his head, and gulped down the potion. Bitter. So bitter. It sucks, totally. He instantly realized what it meant to look good on the outside, but rotten on the inside. His face had contorted as a result of the potion. He wanted to puke, but he couldn't. Then, Klein realized that his face was flushed red. As for the rest of his body, they were experiencing a similar reaction. He was convinced that he looked like a steamed lobster. As for his spirit and mind, they felt like they had been extracted into a thin needle, fusing with the potion, drop by drop, as it stabbed into each and every one of cells. It was a feeling that needed no microscope to observe his cells. Klein stood there and saw the intruder invade his body's most minute areas. For a few seconds, he felt like a robot that was having its parts and electrical circuits swapped out. After an unknown period of time had passed, his mind reflected his figure, as though he was listening to himself singing through his own ears. Due to this strange projection, Klein discovered that he could precisely control his facial and bodily motions. Meanwhile, his ears buzzed. He heard the murmurs and shouting echoing around him which had not happened in a while. Hornasis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Phew. Klein imagined the layered spherical light and slowly entered a cogitation state.
Bit by bit, he escaped from the state of having his spirituality seep out where he had a slight loss of control.
At that moment, he knew that he had advanced successfully. He knew that he was a Sequence 8 clown. Chapter 169. New abilities. After the color in Klein's eyes went back to normal, Christette Casimir said with a laugh, "You can move about and try to get used to the changes in your body. Try to find the core powers that were given to you by the clown potion." Klein nodded. He considered the fact that he might need guidance from the deacon and thus didn't care about his presence. He repeatedly followed what he had been practicing all this time as he took a step forward. He twisted his hips and threw a punch forward, launching a frontal jab. Pa! He heard the crisp sound of his fist breaking the air. The power in the forward thrust exceeded his expectations. In that instant, he felt as though he was sitting in a carriage which had abruptly hit the brakes. He lost his balance and fell forward. Oh no! This is about to become an embarrassing story. Just like Leonard's. Klein mused.
But at that moment, he noticed that he could still effectively control his muscles, his body, as well as his center of gravity.
He simultaneously exerted force with his spine, tendons, and ligaments, instantly adjusting his center of mass and managing to stand firm despite his distorted posture. Well, upon gaining some understanding of this, Klein attempted several other actions. He confirmed that the biggest change in his body was the massive increase in coordination. He would no longer lose his balance unless there were some extenuating circumstances. I feel like a roly-poly tumbler. I can even act in a circus now. It wouldn't be too hard for me to walk on a rope. The clown potion sure lives up to its name. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Klein once again tested the extent of the improvements to his strength, agility, and speed. I should be around the same level as Teacher Gawain. After I get used to this and go through the specialized training, I'll definitely become more powerful. Also, with my current mastery over my body, it would be easy for me to grasp combat techniques. Klein stopped moving and nodded in thought. According to his plans, he estimated that he would become decent in combat arts only after half a year. But after consuming the clown potion, he felt that it would only take a month, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, before he could qualify as a policeman that was adept in combat. That was the difference between an average person and a beyonder. In a sense, the talents of beyonders were beyond the reach of normal humans. Christette watched silently as the newly advanced clown tried out various actions before completely stopping. He then nodded.
It truly is a potion adept in the field of combat.
Without waiting for Klein to speak, he asked, "What sounds did you hear just now?"
I heard someone muttering Hornacis.
Klein wanted to keep the term Phlegria a secret for the time being. He wanted to observe the reaction of Deacon Casimir. If he was willing to relay information regarding the Hornacis mountain range and the nation of the Evernight, Klein would then add on, saying that he heard something different again. Christette nodded slightly, skipping over the topic. He reminded Klein, remember, a high-sequence beyonder can influence corresponding low-sequence beyonders of the same sequence pathway to a certain extent. In a way, some parts of the respective pathways contain the realm of demigods. The murmurings and howls might have been intentionally conveyed to you by them. They might be filled with malicious intent. You must be even more cautious if the sequence pathway belongs to an evil god. I had a chat with Dunn just now. The Nighthawk in your team who lost control recently met with such a situation. Old Neil. The hidden sage. Klein's expression darkened. He nodded solemnly and said, "Your Grace, I will remember this. I will not be tempted by the murmurings or howls. I will not be corrupted by them." At the same time, he thought of something else. Could this be the reason why the church only provides the pathways for Sleepless and Corpse Collector, while hiding a large number of the other pathways? After all, the Sleepless pathway belongs to the Evernight goddess, and Death, which corresponds to the Corpse Collector pathway, has already fallen. As for why the church would still offer the Mystery Prior and Seer, it's because these two jobs are of a support type and can fill the shortcomings of the Sequence 9 and 8 pathways for Sleepless and Corpse Collector. Furthermore, they're only at the beginning of the pathway, so the influence they can gather wouldn't be too prominent. But this doesn't explain why they would hide the names and unique traits of the potions, or the lack of information as to what one should take note of when facing them. Klein retracted his thoughts when he saw Christette Casimir pick up his suitcase to leave. He adopted a curious tone. "Your Grace, I would like to know how to act as a clown. Do I have to go to a circus?
Christet smoothed his tall collar and chuckled. According to our current understanding of philosophy, you just made the mistake of formalism. You need to understand that the name of a potion not only represents a job, it also represents a group of people that share certain traits. For example, we can also describe seers differently. We can call them people who can see fate, yet remain respectful of fate. Of course, as I mentioned before, there are some differences to the rules concluded by each individual even if they consumed the same potion. You cannot completely reference the experiences of another person. Do you understand?
Klein nodded in thought. I think I can understand some of it.
I can act as a clown in my daily life, as long as I have grasped its essence?
In theory, Christet answered, being careful about his choice of words. I understand. Klein drew a crimson moon on his chest. Thank you, Your Grace. May the goddess bless you. Just what is the essence of a clown?
If I don't take into consideration what a clown represents back on Earth and only think about what it means in this world, a clown is a job that entertains people using ridiculous methods. For example, hilarious get-ups, exaggerated actions, trickster-like performances. The core is that it must be ridiculous, and it must entertain others. It feels a little off. Must I consider it from the perspective of court jesters from ancient times? Klein thought about it silently as he felt at a loss. Christet looked at him and also drew a crimson moon before his chest. He smiled, revealing the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. May the goddess bless you too. At that moment, Klein suddenly perceived something, an intuition that felt like a prediction, that Deacon Casimir would put his left foot forward. He then saw Christet pick up the silver suitcase and step toward the entrance of the alchemy room with his left foot. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Klein watched as Christet walked out of the hidden door, his figure vanishing into the corridor. He was dazed for a moment before he felt intense excitement. The beyonder powers of the clown potion were more powerful than he imagined. He could intuitively predict a person's next course of action. Was the combination of this ability, coupled with his powerful coordination, exceptional agility, and speed, as well as decent strength, considered being good at fighting with artifice? Klein thought about this revelation. So, this can be considered the manifestation of the seer's abilities in Sequence 8. But it's not enough. This pathway must be one that gives a unique ability every time I advance before reaching a high sequence beyonder. But the intuitions I get are fleeting, so I don't think I can take advantage of them every single time. Of course, this ability is powerful enough as it is. Taking advantage of it once should be enough to turn defeat into victory. Alright, after I reduce the influence of the negative effects that come with the clown potion, I can try the ritual to summon myself. I nearly forgot about that. Yeah, the captain must have infected me with his awful memory. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein observed himself once again. He wanted to see if the clown potion had brought along any other abilities. According to the confidential records of the Nighthawks, if the potion would allow the person who consumed it to gain mastery over a certain spell, the person would be able to faintly detect what kinds of spells he obtained after advancing as if he was being instilled with knowledge. But I don't sense any of that. In other words, Clown doesn't come with the ability to quickly cast spells, as reported in the confidential records of the Nighthawks. Could the meaning of crafty be that I can now effectively use my expressions and body language to more easily fool people with my lies? Klein stretched his neck while seriously analyzing his current condition. At this moment, he couldn't help but think back to the suited clown he had encountered previously. The clown's peculiar and varied spells had left a deep impression. That member of the secret order is probably a Sequence 7 Beyonder. His clown getup was purely to mask his facial features to avoid being placed on a wanted list. It's no wonder that he could hold his own against 2 Sequence 7s and a Sequence 8. If he had deciphered the fact that I wasn't under the influence of sealed artifact 2-049 and avoided falling under its control, 10 of me might not have been enough to deal with him. Of course, Clown is not completely devoid of spells. There are still spells like these. Klein walked toward the long table and picked up the piece of paper that the clown formula was written on. His pupils darkened and with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the piece of paper into the air. Pah! It was as if the soft piece of paper had become a dagger, and it pierced itself into the wall of the alchemy room. I can bring a deck of tarot cards with me in the future. They can be used both for divination or as weapons. Klein collected himself and started to pack up the objects left behind from the potion's concoction. After dealing with this and burning the formula for the potion, Klein exhaled and left the alchemy room, closing the secret door behind him. For the time being, he didn't feel like trying to entertain others through ridiculous methods because of what happened to old Neil. He intended to lessen the influence of the potion through cogitation first. Phew. This is going to be a brand new experience again. No matter what happens, I'm no longer just a supporting member. Yes, ever since old Neil passed away, I'm the only one left in the Tinjin Nighthawks team that can provide support. The Holy Cathedral will most likely send a mystery prior or a seer to the team. Klein followed the wall lamps, walking down the dark corridor, and calmly made his way up the stairs leading to the Blackthorn Security Company. He then saw the sunlight in the Nighthawks recreation room. The sunlight shone in through the oriel window, sunlight which was pure and warm. Chapter 170. Copper Whistle. Klein turned towards the captain's office and saw that the door was wide open. Dunn Smith was leaning back in his chair, sniffing at his pipe. When Dunn swept his gray eyes at him, he changed his seating posture. You seem to be in good shape, nothing like someone who had just consumed a potion. This might be the advantage of fully digesting a potion before leveling up. Klein closed the door behind him and took a seat. He and Dunn both knew about the acting method, so their oath didn't keep them from talking about the acting method with each other. They could exchange their thoughts about it, but the two of them didn't bring it up with a tacit understanding. They fell silent at the same time after the exchange. Klein thought and asked, "Has His Grace left?" "Yes, as a high-ranking deacon, he has other matters to take care of." Dunn thought for a moment. "Oh, he took the pair of red eyeballs that remained after old Neil died." Klein was shocked and confused. "Why?" Dunn picked up his coffee and took a sip. He answered after a long silence, "We shouldn't lie to ourselves. A rampager is in fact already a monster, and as I told you before, monsters leave behind things that are rich with beyonder powers after they die. When these relics can't be controlled, they have to be sealed. Yes, that is one of the most common origins of sealed artifacts. According to the Nighthawks' internal rules, the items left behind by rampagers need to be stored elsewhere, so that they won't trigger their partners. A logical rule." Klein nodded heavily. Suddenly, he sharply noticed that the captain had missed out something. So he asked curiously, "What if the item left behind is controllable?" Dunn looked at him. His gray eyes were deep like a quiet night. He sighed and said, "You wouldn't want to know the answer." Klein was taken aback before he suddenly realized a possibility. Normal monsters left behind beyonder ingredients which could be used to make potions. But what of a rampager who turned into a monster? If they left behind controllable items, would those things be used as beyonder ingredients? Upon realizing that, Klein suddenly felt a strong sense of disgust. He couldn't help but turn his head to retch. Even his sight suddenly grew blurry. This is such a terrifying theory. But it's an answer that's highly likely of being closer to the truth. In that instant, he had a deeper understanding of sayings like, "To fight against the abyss, we have to endure the corruption of the abyss, and we are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness." Would this be one of the reasons why the church hides the acting method? So that they can recycle a certain number of their own members for spare parts? But this will make members of the upper echelons reject the church. Klein's face clearly reflected his changing expressions. Upon seeing his response, Dunn suddenly laughed. There was a twinkling light in his gray eyes. "Think about it on the brighter side of things. You can think of it as our teammates watching over us in a different form. They will be with us forever." After saying that, Dunn lowered his head, picked up his coffee and brought it to his mouth. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, he lifted his head and said, "And you don't have to worry. As long as we can find sources of beyonder ingredients, we wouldn't do what you were thinking about. All right, according to the rules, you'll receive a day off since you just advanced. You can decide whether or not you want to go to your combat training this afternoon, but you have to inform Gawain either way." Klein gently nodded. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his back and said, "Captain, I have finished my lessons on mysticism. I'd like to use my mornings to learn techniques such as tracking and monitoring." He paused and added with a serious expression, "I'd like to fulfill my full duty as a Nighthawk soon." Dunn gave him a piercing look and sighed. "You're tougher than I imagined. As you wish." "Yes, Captain." Klein suddenly stood up and drew a crimson moon on his chest. After leaving the Blackthorn Security Company, Klein didn't return home to rest, but instead, took the opportunity to take a trackless carriage to Azek's place. Ding dong, ding dong. As the doorbell rang clearly, Azek opened the door in a white shirt and black vest. There was a gold watch chain hanging from his vest pocket. "Don't you need to work?" Azek took a glance at the sky and realized that the sun had yet to climb to its peak. "I actually have most of the day off due to some special circumstances," Klein explained vaguely. Azek looked at him and appeared to notice something as he nodded and made way for Klein's entry. At the hallway, Klein set his cane aside, took off his hat, and followed Azek to the living room. The living room was comfortably furnished with a fireplace, rocking chair, couches, and a coffee table. Klein sat at his usual spot. Azek sat down opposite Klein and pointed at the cigars on the coffee table. "Do you want one?" "No." Klein shook his head firmly. Azek didn't attempt to persuade him as he struck a match and lit one of the cigars. At the same time, he asked casually, "Have you taken care of the matter at Morristown?" "I have to thank you for that," Klein replied sincerely. At the same time, he secretly lampooned Mr. Azek. "Before you lost your memories, you definitely must have left behind quite a sizable wealth for yourself. Otherwise, how could a teacher who isn't even an associate professor be able to enjoy cigars so frequently?" As Azek was fiddling with his cigar, Klein brought up a matter. "Mr. Azek, I have something to ask you." "What is it?" Azek replied without lifting his head. Klein paused and organized his words. "One of my colleagues lost control and became a monster. I'd like to know if his spirit was contaminated." He wasn't certain if Mr. Azek knew the meaning of losing control, so he prepared an explanation, just in case. Azek stopped what he was doing and lifted his head to look at Klein. He nodded heavily and said, "No doubt. You have to be very careful in a situation like that. If he lost control due to the temptation of an evil god or devil, try to avoid contacting his spirit. It might very likely lead to life-threatening danger." "I understand." Klein let out a breath of disappointment. When he was at old Neil's place, he was too emotional and had forgotten to contact old Neil's spirit. Neither did Dunn Smith remind him at all. Hence, he missed the opportunity entirely. Now that I think of it, Captain didn't forget but intentionally avoided bringing it up. Klein was silent in thought. He didn't dwell on the topic and instead mentioned his previous encounter. "Mr. Azek, I tried to divine the origins of Morristown's paranormal incidents. I ended up seeing an upside-down pyramid that extended underground. My teammate told me that it's a symbol of death. Only his descendants would receive such an honor." Azek put down the match and took up the cigar cutter when he suddenly fell into a daze. He was motionless for quite a while. He leaned back into his seat and wore an unusually gloomy expression. After a while, he said in a deep voice, "This gives me a very familiar feeling, but I don't seem to be recalling anything." "I'm very sorry." Klein sighed sincerely. He had imagined that he could use the revelation obtained from his divination to further jolt Mr. Azek's memories. Azek cut off the cigar cap, shook his head, and smiled bitterly. "If it was something that could be recalled easily, I think I would have long found a way to escape my fate. Of course, I have to thank you for your kindness. Thank you for remembering about me this entire time." He thought for a moment before adding, "Oh, and I'll be leaving Tingen in the near future." "Why?" Klein asked in surprise. "Didn't we say that we were going to find the manipulator behind the scenes, the person who affected my fate, and stole your child's skull?" Azek held his cigar and sighed before explaining. "The target might have noticed my attention and investigation. He hasn't been taking any action recently, leaving me with no clues. Thus, I'm thinking of leaving Tingen for the time being and going to Backlund. On one hand, I can take the opportunity to search for traces that I left behind before I lost my memories. On the other hand, my absence might let the target lower his guard." "That's right. Mr. Azek's last memory loss was around Backlund University. It's a pity that you can't take my place, searching for the Red Chimney House." Klein nodded solemnly and said, "I'll pay close attention to this. Once the target takes action and exposes himself, I'll inform you immediately." Mr. Azek, how will I inform you of things in a timely manner?" Klein had the idea that if Azek was Death's descendant, or if he was linked to Death in a certain way, his powers would have been something similar to the corpse collector sequence. He definitely had a way to call something like Daly's messenger. In other words, this could confirm if Azek was actually related to Death or a descendant of Death. Azek took a puff of his cigar and thought for nearly 20 seconds. He took out an ornament from his left sleeve. It was an intricate but old copper whistle. There were many unique patterns that filled it with a mysterious aura.
This is something that I had with me when I woke up in Backlund. When you blow it, you'll summon a messenger that belongs to me. Isaac held the copper whistle as he explained in detail. After so many years, this copper whistle can still be used? This should be a magical item, right? Klein was surprised and delighted that he had indirectly proved that Mr. Isaac was related to death. Isaac gave Klein a glance. Then he put the copper whistle to his mouth and demonstrated. His cheeks puffed up as he blew with all his might. Nothing was heard, but Klein felt a sudden gloominess and coldness. He quickly tapped his left molar and saw that there were blurry white bones being thrown up from the ground, one after another, forming a strange fountain. After a few seconds, there was an illusory monster in the living room. Its body was made of white bones, and there were dark flames glowing in its eye sockets. It was almost 4 meters tall, and it towered over Klein, who wasn't even 175 centimeters tall. As he watched its head nearly tear through the ceiling, Klein suddenly had a thought. Mr. Isaac, isn't your messenger a little too exaggerated? Isaac didn't share those thoughts at all. He smiled and said, after you pass the letter to it, blow the whistle again to end the summoning. Then, it'll send the letter to me very quickly, in a secretive manner. After that, Isaac shook his wrist and threw the old copper whistle across the room. Klein extended his right hand and accurately caught it. He found it cold but mild. Thank you, clown potion. He breathed a sigh of relief. He wiped the whistle and blew it hard. Silently, the huge messenger fell apart as blurry white bones sank underground. The Tussock River ran through Backlund and harbors that dotted around the area. Alger Wilson wore the long priest robes of the Church of the Lord of Storms as he walked down from the passenger ship slowly. He saw people walking to and fro around the harbor with countless port workers sweating under the sun. It was a bustling yet noisy scene. It's been a while, Backlund, Alger muttered to himself. Chapter 171. Promotion and pay raise. After leaving Isaac's house, Klein took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. As he opened the door to his house, he suddenly saw a figure sitting in his dining room. Klein instinctively tightened his grip on the cane in his hand, but quickly realized what was going on. It wasn't a thief, but his maid, Bella. Bella was focused on reading a spread-out newspaper on the table. She jumped in shock when she heard the door open, quickly standing up and stammering, I was just done with the tasks for the morning. I was waiting for the water to boil so that I could eat some bread. I'm still not really used to having a maid in the house. Klein mocked himself. He took off his hat and nodded. Reading is a good habit. To be able to persist in reading, despite the busy workload, is something that's encouraged by the goddess. He used the name of the goddess just in case Bella took his compliment as sarcasm. But in reality, only the god of knowledge and wisdom would place this much emphasis on reading. Of course, all of the churches advocate education. Yes, since she's about 18 years old and believes in the goddess, Bella's love for reading must be influenced by her parents. Parents like this would send their daughter to receive an education as long as they can afford it. Even if they cannot afford public schools, there are always the free schools provided by the church. At most, it would just delay her education. Thus, Bella isn't illiterate. She can understand words and read the newspaper. Klein thought as he walked into the living room after setting his cane down. He had quite a good impression of Bella. Even though she was a little clumsy and obviously not used to the kitchen, she had shown a willingness to learn. Bella let her hands hang down and said, embarrassed, I didn't have the opportunity to read many newspapers in the past. The landlord didn't let us use old newspapers to clean the walls. I stole a glance at it when I picked up the newspapers just now to clean the coffee table. I thought that it was rather interesting. What a pitiful lady. When I transmigrated, newspapers were the least interesting of things. Klein thought as he lampooned. He smiled and took out the silver pocket watch from his pocket. After looking at the time, he said, as long as you complete your tasks and do them well, you are free to do whatever you want with the rest of your time. You don't need to be too nervous. Of course, if I'm having a chat with Benson and Melissa, it's best that you stay in your room. I will allow you to use the lamp inside and take a few old newspapers with you. Oh, please knock at my door at 1 in the afternoon. Then prepare a cup of black tea, 2 pieces of soft white bread, a piece of wheat toast, and a small plate of butter for me. In order to celebrate his advancement to Sequence 8, Klein decided to spoil himself slightly. He was going to eat the white bread ahead of Benson, who was planning on having it over the weekend. Well, I'll buy 8 more pounds of bread soon. In the future, We shall make the change in our staple dish, from wheat bread to white bread. As a Sequence 8 Beyonder, my weekly pay is definitely going to increase. To think that the captain didn't mention this. He forgot again. Klein froze for a moment and decided to clarify it tomorrow.
All right, Bella replied in surprise and joy.
Following that, she asked with a little uncertainty, Mr. Klein, do you mean the Psy black tea used to entertain guests? She called him by his first name as Moretti could be used to refer to anyone in the family.
Yes, that shall be my usual tea in the future.
Klein waved his hand and made his way towards the stairs. He suddenly noticed that he was in a decent financial situation after becoming a clown. This was partly because there were no other large expenses for the time being.
He only needed to spend 2 solely on transport while he was investigating the houses with red chimneys, and on the materials that he needed to purchase occasionally.
Claims could be made for the latter most of the time anyway. Also, there was a sum of £300 in Klein's anonymous bank account.
It was important to understand that 1 hour of land in the countryside only cost 5 to 6.5 solely, which was another way of saying that Klein could afford 920 to 1200 areas of farmland, which was equivalent to 137 to 179 mal, sup 2/sup back on Earth.
Furthermore, this sum of money could allow Klein to buy a house on Daffodil Street on a contract for 15 years. If I convert all that money into land, I'll get between £23 and £31 a year in rent. That's not bad, but not necessary for the time being. I'll use that £300 for emergencies. I'll have to find an opportunity to tell Benson and Melissa about my true weekly salary.
Klein thought as he entered his room.
After locking the door to his room, Klein sat on the edge of his bed and started his cogitation. He wanted to use this method to slowly control the powers seeping out of his potion. He was very careful and very cautious. He had thought of the term losing control very lightly until he saw the mandated Punisher who had lost control. Of course, he didn't know that mandated Punisher personally. He also didn't know what had happened to him. He subconsciously thought of him as an anomaly, a rare case. It was just like how an average person would make comments about a murder they saw on the news before forgetting about it entirely. But what happened to old Neil shook Klein greatly. It made him realize very clearly that losing control was always a possibility, always around him. Loss of control might descend upon him in ways he had never thought about. That sure was a bloody lesson. Klein ended his cogitation and muttered to himself as he opened his eyes. He had dreamed of that scene many times in the past few days, jolting awake in the process and finding himself drenched in cold sweat. He wasn't only grieving old Neil's death, but also worried about his future. If he didn't have cogitation to help him sleep, he believed that there would be many sleepless nights in his future. Other than digesting the potion, I also have to try my best to control my emotions and desires. I have to keep them within reasonable levels and not be consumed by them. Klein exhaled and laid down, quickly falling asleep. On the day that old Neil passed away, Dunn's actions and words had touched him greatly. It made him critically assess the responsibilities of a Nighthawk for the first time. It made him want to take up his responsibilities and help his captain and teammates. Thus, he didn't intend to waste his afternoon. He was going to continue his combat lessons. 3 in the afternoon, on a crude training field. The blonde crew-cut Gawain creased his brows as he witnessed Klein slowly familiarize himself with emotions, going from the movements of a decent beginner to the movements of an apprentice knight who had been practicing for a good 6 months. All this happened in the short span of 40 minutes. He called for Klein to stop and sized him up. He couldn't help but ask, what happened? Klein had already come up with an excuse. He was prepared to attribute his performance to scientific research when Gawain added, "You don't need to answer if it's inconvenient for you to do so." It looks like there was some communication between the police department and Gawain. It makes sense. He has to train Beyonders occasionally, so how could he not know? Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He smiled as he said, "Teacher, how long do you think I will need before I can take part in actual combat?" Gawain crossed his arms and looked at Klein seriously. He replied with a raspy voice, 2 or 3 days, but that isn't enough. He explained, as if in thought, being able to take part in actual combat isn't the same as being good at fighting. The latter would take another 2 to 3 weeks. Furthermore, you need to gain mastery over weapons that you can bring with you, for example, a cane, whips, daggers, and bayonets. There's still so many to learn? Klein was dumbfounded. Gawain swept his experienced gaze at him. Remember, every drop of sweat you lose here might save your life in the future. Yes, teacher. Klein pumped himself up and answered.
On Sunday morning, Klein entered the Blackthorn Security Company and knocked on the door of the captain's office. Dunn Smith looked up as if he was expecting this.
"I forgot to inform you yesterday. Your position at the police department has risen from probationary inspector to inspector now that you have advanced to sequence 8. I'll get them to issue the appropriate documents and epaulets to you as soon as possible. Your weekly salary will also increase from £6 to £10. The church and the police department will each bear half of your salary. This salary is the level of an experienced Nighthawk. Of course, I mean an experienced Nighthawk at sequence 9. Captain, are you following the wrong script?" Klein was taken aback as he listened to the captain. His eyebrows relaxed as he smiled. "That's more than I imagined." He had imagined that his weekly salary would only increase to £8. Dunn lifted his cup of coffee and took a sip. The increase in salary for Nighthawks is firstly dependent on years of service, second on contribution, and third on the level of your job. The third criterion is often highly correlated with your contributions. Right, without any contributions, even if one were to digest their potion, they would be unable to apply for the formula and materials. Klein nodded while in thought. A weekly salary of £10, coupled with any bonuses, would mean a yearly salary of about £540. Since he didn't need to pay any taxes, this salary was fairly high in the middle income bracket, just lower than desirable occupations such as esteemed lawyers, famous architects, experienced surgeons, and government workers. Even the vice president of the Lone Kingdom's treasury only makes £700 a year before tax. That's at most £640 after tax. Probably lower. According to the newspapers, a decent house in Backland and Hillston only costs about £2,500. With Benson, Melissa, and my current expenditure, we could buy one in 7 or 8 years. To be able to afford a bungalow in the central area of the capital in just 7 or 8 years purely through my own efforts. This salary makes me happy indeed. Klein got up and bade farewell. He quickly walked to the basement and took his shift at Cheney's Gate. Before it was 10, he suddenly heard someone approaching Cheney's Gate. Soon after, Dunn appeared at the door. "There's a case that requires your help." "An incident involving Beyonders?" Klein instinctively asked. "No, a parliamentary representative of this city, Mr. Maynard, was found dead in his house. The Tingen Police Department is under huge pressure and wants us to use a mediumship ritual to help them pinpoint the murderer. Currently, you are the only person on the team who can do that," Dunn explained. Then he added, "The Holy Cathedral will send over a mystery prior to our team next week. Actually, it should have been done a long time ago, but you happened to join and chose to be a seer." Chapter 172. Autopsy. How long has the Member of Parliament been dead for? Klein asked straightforwardly as he packed up his things. If it was more than 15 minutes, the information that he could obtain would decline considerably. If it was more than an hour, there would be very little left to find. If it was more than a month, contact with the spirit of the dead would most likely fail. Regrettably, the initial autopsy report shows that Mr. Maynard died between 9 and 11 last night. Dunn shook his head and said, "You only need to provide assistance and not consider if you can be of use." "All right." Klein took his coat and walked out of the duty room with his hat and cane in hand. Dunn Smith took his place at the Cheney's Gate guardroom. Theoretically, as a Beyonder, as long as one's spirituality was enhanced, things like spirit vision, divination, and ritualistic magic could be learned. Especially for Beyonders from the Sleepless sequence who were known for their high spirituality. But in actual fact, the differences between the various sequences was vastly obvious. Dunn Smith and Leonard Mitchell had learned spirit vision, but they could only see faint white or light blue in the auras of others. They were unable to precisely differentiate the status of different body parts. Of course, they could definitely see spiritual things with spirit vision, but doing so wasn't as effective as using their spiritual perception. That also led to a problem in which Beyonders at the Sleepless, Midnight Poet, and Nightmare sequences didn't enjoy activating their spirit vision. Similarly, if they were willing to, they could also learn spirit pendulums, dowsing, dream divination, and so on. But their rate of success wasn't something worth noting. It was the same situation with ritualistic magic as well. When the two of them walked past one another, Dunn suddenly said, "I forgot to tell you that Inspector Tolley is in charge of the case. He's waiting for you at the reception hall in the security company. Remember to change into your new uniform and grab your new documents." Klein wasn't surprised and replied with a smile. "New uniform, new documents? The Tianjin Police Department sure is efficient. He had just advanced to Sequence 8 the day before. It's because this case is very important, so. Dunn spread his hands and took up Klein's previous spot. Klein walked upstairs, but he wasn't in a hurry to go to the reception hall. He entered the Nighthawk's break room and entered the attached bathroom to relieve himself. There was only a toilet bowl, a water bottle, and a bucket in the duty room. Then, he changed into his police uniform that revealed his promotion to 2 silver stars and put on his peak cap with the 2 crossed swords and a crown. After transferring his flaring sun charm, Azek's copper whistle, his ritual ingredients, and other items, Klein smoothed out his uniform, took his cane, and exited the break room. He passed through the partition and saw Inspector Tolley seated in the sofa area. It had been a while since they last met. The tall police officer seemed to have gained some weight, and his stomach was even more outstanding. With his thick mustache and hair, he looked like a brown bear that had just escaped from a circus. "I'm glad to work with you again." When Tolley saw that it was a Nighthawk that he knew, he let out a breath of relief. He stood up and extended his bare paw. "No, palm." Klein corrected himself and shook the other person's hand as a polite gesture. "Me too." Tolley stole a glance at Klein's 2 shimmering silver star shoulder strap and said with envy, "We're at the same rank now, and it hasn't even been a month." At first, Klein wanted to reply solemnly that the danger that we encounter is 10 times worse than yours, but he remembered his identity then. Sequence 8 Clown. "Maybe I can give it a try." Using his spirituality, he looked at the reflection of his facial expression. He lifted the corner of his lips and replied with a smile. "Maybe in another few months, you'll have to call me sir." "You sure are humorous." Tolley chuckled and pointed at the door. "Shall we head out?" "All right." Klein hadn't given up his cane. Now that he had become a clown, the cane was truly a viable weapon. After exiting the Blackthorn Security Company, Klein and Tolley walked down side by side, forming a great contrast due to the skinniness and fatness of the two. "I feel like we could even make an audience at the circus laugh," Klein suddenly jested. Tolley nodded in absolute agreement and said, "Yes, I feel our vast contrast brings a comedic effect. Do you know that some circuses are trying to use fat and skinny, tall and short clown combinations in their performances?" "No, actually I meant a beast tamer and a brown bear." Klein, of course, wouldn't make such a rude remark. He went along with it and replied, "It's a pity that there are no fixed circuses in Tianjin." "That's right, but we have operas, theaters, and music halls," Inspector Tolley replied wistfully. They casually chatted until they got onto the police carriage. Then, Klein redirected the topic back to the case. "Is it confirmed that Mr. Maynard was murdered?" "We can't be certain, but his wife and 2 sons aren't willing to believe the possibility that he died due to a sudden illness. And there was really something wrong at the scene. When Maynard was found, he was naked on the guest room's bed," Tolley said as he deliberated. "He sleeps separately from his wife?" Klein leaned back against the carriage wall and mimicked the main character in various detective films. Tolley shook his head and said, "No. His wife hasn't been in Tianjin recently. She went to Backlund to attend a very important social ball. You might not know, but she's the leader of a new party. She's the daughter of someone from the House of Commons. She's still on her way back to Tianjin via steam locomotive. She merely used the telegram to express her opinion on this matter. Maynard is also a member of the new party. He's been a Tianjin's member of parliament for more than 10 years. He intended to run for mayor in next year's election. In other words, his death might be related to this?" Klein asked casually and immediately laughed. "I'm sorry, I'm only supposed to be helping with the autopsy. The rest of the matter is not within my area of concern. You don't have to answer." Tolley didn't mind much but sighed. "Autopsy. You're very cautious. As for your guesses, I would only say that there's a possibility. There was a gathering last night at Maynard's place. There were too many guests, and we temporarily can't find any main suspects. Plus, these guests have decent backgrounds, so we have to be very careful. We can't make any mistakes." "I understand." Klein nodded faintly and asked about the details of the scene. Maynard's house was a bungalow located in the Golden Indus borough. It was surrounded by gardens and fields. There was a stable, a fountain, and a broad pathway built from cement. Klein put on his peak hat with its police badge and followed behind Inspector Tolley. They passed through the police streamer and entered the double-story house under the gaze of every policeman present. In the living room,
There were 2 male and 4 female probationary inspectors who were talking to people individually to gather statements. Klein looked around and saw many gentlemen in tuxedos and a few ladies in glamorous dresses and checkered gauze hats. "They're the guests who spent the night here," Tully explained and led Klein up the stairs to the 2nd floor directly. Along the way, when the police constables who were searching through the rooms saw the 2, they revealed a look of respect without stopping them. Perhaps it was the effect of the inspector epaulets. "This is the guest room where Maynard's corpse was discovered." The brawny Tully stopped by the crimson wooden door. Klein thought and asked, "Which guest was assigned to this guest room?" "Nobody. There are too many guest rooms in the house, so it wasn't used." Tully put on his white gloves and turned the knob of the crimson wooden door. He made the constable who was keeping watch leave temporarily. Then he nodded at Klein and said, "Inspector Moretti, I'll leave the rest to you. May the goddess bless us, and I hope that we find something." Klein put on his white gloves too and locked the door behind him. He walked to the side of the bed and saw that the crimson bed sheets were abnormally messy. The corpse laying on it was covered with a white cloth. At this point, Klein could be considered to be quite experienced. He pulled away the white cloth without fear and looked at Member of Parliament Maynard. The man was in his 40s. His blonde hair was trimmed short, and his expression was a mixture of pain and happiness. Klein took 2 steps back and took out the ingredients he needed. He quickly finished the setup for the mediumship ritual. As the faint calming fragrance swirled around him, he recited the divination statement that he thought of long ago, the cause of Maynard's death. The cause of Maynard's death. As he recited the statement, Klein retreated to a nearby high-back chair and sat down slowly. His eyes darkened, then he leaned back and quickly fell into a deep sleep. In the illusory and blurry world, he suddenly saw the gentleman from earlier. With his opened blue eyes, Maynard was laying prostrate above a woman with an outstanding body and fair skin. He was thrusting hard against her body. He first displayed an expression of extreme satisfaction and happiness. Then, he suddenly clutched his chest with his right hand. His expression then grew contorted. "Pah!" As Maynard fell, the image quickly shattered. Klein opened his eyes and woke up from his dream. "I can't believe I can actually watch porn in such a manner." So, Maynard had an affair and died of exhaustion? Klein chuckled and massaged his temples. He took out a pen and paper before doing another ritual. He drew a portrait of the lady he had seen in his dream with the aid of the ritual. Of course, everything below her neck was omitted. It was a woman whose age was hard to tell. She had the mature vibe of a woman in her 30s, but there was a remnant of innocence to her. Her eyes were crystal clear, and she had a delicate look. Klein looked at his work, then put away his ritual ingredients, and dispelled the spirituality wall. He leaned sideways to grab his silver-edged cane. Suddenly, he heard the reverberating sound of someone clearing their throat. He immediately got goosebumps. Klein looked towards the bed and saw Maynard gripping the crimson bedsheet so tightly that the tendons on the backs of his hands were protruding out. With a swoosh, the Member of Parliament who died between 9 and 11 the previous night suddenly sat up. Saliva drooled from the corners of his lips as he opened his vacant eyes wide. Chapter 173. Zombiefication. Before Klein could come up with any new ideas, he saw the rigid Maynard lift both his hands up. Its body lunged forward to his left amidst the sound of hurtling wind. In the past, his dulled reactions under such sudden, unexpected situations would have made it hard for him to avoid this. Even if he had noticed the attack ahead of time, he would have had to roll away to avoid the fast-moving corpse. But now, Klein could nearly react on instinct. He stomped down with his bright buttonless leather boots and jumped diagonally onto the high-back chair. As it had only been a day since he advanced, he was still getting used to his power, agility, and speed. He had accidentally leaped too high into the air and landed on the top of the chair's high back. It was a narrow edge. Klein's heart tightened as he quickly controlled his body and adjusted his center of gravity. He wavered for a moment and surprisingly managed to stabilize himself, like a black cat flaunting its balance and poise. As he was wavering, he flailed his left arm, swinging his cane into the zombie's ribs as it pounced forward. The strike caused it to lose its balance as it staggered and fell onto the carpet. Klein was standing on top of the chair as he felt for his revolver by raising his right arm. He attempted to pull it out from the holster so that he could deliver a silver demon hunting bullet at the zombie in front of him. But in that instant, he suddenly wondered about the aftermath. If he were to blow a hole in Member of Parliament Maynard's corpse, How was he going to explain the cause of death to the deceased's family or members of parliament who were focusing on the matter?
All I did was double-tap his corpse?
As he was thinking, Klein reached into the pocket of his police uniform and felt for a triangular plate.
The Requiem charm. He quickly made a decision.
He took out the silver amulet without hesitation and let out a low shout in Hermes. Crimson. As the incantation reverberated within the room, the charm started to release a peaceful aura. Klein quickly infused his spirituality into the amulet and tossed it to Zombie Maynard, who was struggling to get up.
A cold blue fire appeared, enveloping the triangular plate.
A serene and gentle black aura spread forth rapidly, eliminating the anxiety and worry of the soul. Zombie Maynard stopped there, his eyes staring blankly at the ground.
His saliva dripped onto the carpet.
Klein heaved a sigh of relief and planned to take out the materials and set up a ritual to purify the desecrated being. But suddenly, Maynard once again let out a groan. His blank eyes focused on the left pocket of Klein's police uniform again.
Shit!
Klein leaped from the top of the chair to the ledge of the oriel window. At the same time, he heard the sound of the chair breaking.
Klein had no choice but to take out a rectangular silver plate. The slumber charm. It wasn't only living things that could be put into a deep sleep.
The dead were in a state of eternal sleep and would only be woken up under unusual circumstances.
In certain books on mysticism, there was even such a description regarding zombies. They slumber by the day and wake up in the night.
Crimson.
Klein once again recited the incantation in Hermes. He intended to disregard the consequences and shoot the corpse with his revolver if that failed again. The problems that came later wouldn't matter if he was dead. As he felt the silver rectangular plate in his palm turn cold, Klein injected his spirituality into it and tossed the charm out.
A dark red flame illuminated his eyes as the sound of a light explosion reverberated around the room.
A gentle power spread forth, bringing with it a fatigue that affected every living being.
Zombie Maynard had just propped himself up using the chair when he wavered. His eyes closed, and he fell on his back with a plop.
With what had just happened, Klein didn't dare to relax. He immediately took out the amantha extract distilled from night vanilla, slumber flower, and chamomile, as well as the bark of the drago tree, and the full moon essence oil made from moonflowers. He quickly set up a sacrificial altar. Right on the heels of that, he sealed the surrounding area with a spirituality wall with the aid of holy night powder, encompassing the altar and the sleeping Zombie Maynard.
After silently reciting the incantation and lighting 3 corresponding candles, he dripped a few drops of essential oil extract and scattered various powders onto the flames.
Klein then took a step back and cautiously looked at Zombie Maynard.
He then recited in Hermes, "O ever-night goddess, nobler than the stars and more eternal than eternity.
I pray for your loving grace.
I pray that you look over your loyal guardian. I pray for the power of the crimson. I pray for the power of sleep and silence. I pray that you purify the unclean being around me," the gentleman once called John Maynard.
Moonflower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please bestow your powers to my incantation.
Slumber flower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please bestow your powers to my incantation. It was as if a midnight breeze blew within the wall of spirituality.
A thin veil of black steam started to billow from Zombie Maynard. When everything settled, Klein used his spirit vision and divination to repeatedly confirm that the zombie wouldn't awaken once more. After seeing the results, his worries eased. He ended the ritual and dispelled the wall of spirituality. Why would he suddenly come back to life? Klein stood in front of Maynard, who was on the carpet. He knitted his brows as he looked down at the corpse.
To a beyonder with high spiritual sensitivity, there were obvious signs to note if a corpse would come back to life or not, much less Klein, who was a seer.
He often had a premonition of similar matters, but what had happened just now completely took him by surprise. Unless there is a more mysterious influence at play. Just like what happened with the suited clown.
Klein recalled the scene in his head and faintly sensed the problem. Zombie Maynard had been trying to attack the left pocket of his police uniform.
Left pocket? Klein transferred his black cane to his right palm, then reached for the pocket with his left hand. He took out the ancient copper whistle that was inside. It was a copper whistle carved with many mysterious patterns. It was the copper whistle used to summon Azek's messenger. This copper whistle zombified Maynard? That's quite plausible. Even if Mr. Azek isn't a descendant of death, he definitely has a certain connection with death. It's logical that the objects that he carries with him would produce such an effect. Klein nodded in thought. He took out a copper penny and did a quick divination about his conclusion.
As he was at the scene of the incident, holding the relevant objects, and had ample information, he quickly got a result. He saw the copper penny fall into his palm. Portrait facing up. This means yes. To think that Mr. Azek didn't remind me to be cautious that these things could happen. Well, he's an amnesiac, so it's not uncommon to forget this. Besides, the copper whistle might not have had negative effects when it was on him. There's a high possibility that it was suppressed. I shouldn't take this copper whistle with me when I'm at cemeteries or ancient castles, places that are prone to hauntings. Otherwise, I'll just be finding trouble for myself and crazily court death. Klein silently made a mental note. He then carried the naked Maynard back onto the bed without much effort. Looking at the obvious mark on the corpse left behind by the stroke of the cane, Klein sighed. He covered the corpse with a piece of white cloth and pretended not to notice. I'll leave this problem to the police department to vex over it. Oh, and the 2 charms I used just now can be considered mission-related expenses, so I can get compensated, he thought as he packed up. He then took the portrait and unlocked the door. The door opened with a creak and Klein saw Inspector Tolley, who had been guarding outside, not allowing anyone to come near. What happened just now? Tolley asked in doubt and worry. He could faintly hear the action going on in the room. Klein smiled and deliberately said with a little exaggeration, Member of Parliament Maynard came back to life and tried to give me a passionate hug. Don't joke like that. Tolley looked into the room in exasperation. Why so serious? Klein said, throwing up his hands. Due to an unconfirmed reason, Member of Parliament Maynard became a zombie. Well, the kind of things that would happen in ghost stories. Fortunately, I hadn't left yet, so I used ritualistic magic to purify the desecration, allowing him to return to his eternal slumber. Is this related to his cause of death? Tolley asked, his expression stern. I cannot give you an answer to that. I don't even know what the problem is. You should know that in our field, unexplainable things are a common occurrence, Klein said. He then looked at the portrait in his hand. When I was doing the mediumship ritual, I saw the scene of Maynard's death. He was engaging in some activities that should only be done between a husband and wife with this woman. And at the climax of his joy, he clutched his chest where the heart is. You mean that is the cause of his death? Tolley gave him a nudge and wink look. In theory, yes, but you should wait for the autopsy. Klein handed the portrait over to Inspector Tolley. Tolley had only glanced at it when he exclaimed, Madam Sharon. Klein looked at him, lost. Is she very famous? Yeah, judging from her looks and figure, she should be famous. He lampooned in his heart. Tolley looked around and introduced her in a somewhat excited manner. Madam Sharon is the prettiest widow in Tinjin City. She's the most sought-after lady in social settings. She was the second wife of Baron Xueqi, but unfortunately became widowed. She is welcomed by many amongst the nouveau riche merchants and aristocrats, someone who can be invited to banquets by both the Conservative Party and the New Party. It's rumored that she and her stepson, the current Baron Xueqi, are on friendly terms with many nobles and senior civil servants in Backland. She's a powerful lady. To think that she and Member of Parliament Maynard had such a relationship. Hee. Simply put, she's an exceptional socialite. Klein secretly concluded. He turned around and pointed into the room. The next part is not included in my job description. How you interrogate Madam Sharon is none of my business. Also, I hit Member of Parliament Maynard with a cane before the purification. You'll have to deal with it and think of an explanation. Chapter 174. Madam Sharon, what? The bear-like Tolley jumped in shock and looked at Klein before looking into the room. With agility that wasn't suited to his body, he dashed in. He pulled back the white cloth that covered the corpse and after examining the body carefully, he heaved a breath of relief. It's better than I imagined. It's not that serious a problem. Maybe I should have drawn my revolver and shot Maynard 5 times with demon hunting bullets. Let's see if you find that serious or not. Klein lampooned inwardly and pointed outside the door. That's all that you need me for, right? No. Tolley shouted. Wait a moment. Klein asked, puzzled. Why? Tolley explained seriously. We have to prevent any accidents from happening. After we talk to Madam Sharon and get her testimony, I'll send you back to Zutland Street. If Maynard can resurrect after being dead for 10 hours, what else couldn't happen? What would I do if you leave? Tolley added in his head. All right. Klein massaged his temple and said, Find a quiet room for me to rest in then. He wasn't feeling his best in every aspect as he had just advanced a day ago. Having just performed multiple ritual ceremonies, used 2 charms, and suffered a non-trivial scare, he needed to enter cogitation to eliminate any problems. Klein was now extremely cautious about losing control. Tolly covered the dead body with the white cloth again. He obviously relaxed and replied, "No problem." He brought Klein to a guest room that was closer to the sunlit side of the house. He pointed and said, "Inspector Moretti, don't worry. No one will disturb you. I'll be paying Madame Sharon a visit first." Klein nodded slightly and watched him walk away. Then, he closed the door and drew the curtains. In the dim and silent bedroom, he slowly walked over to the rocking chair and sat down comfortably. He allowed his body to rock back and forth rhythmically. There were countless spherical phantasmal lights overlapping in his mind. The buzzing sounds in Klein's ears and the throbbing ache in his head slowly vanished, bit by bit. When his situation stabilized, he opened his eyes and looked into the darkness. He outlined a bed, cupboard, and other furniture. Then, he calmly thought about his earlier attempts. There isn't much feedback from a few exaggerated jokes. Maybe I have yet to control the powers of the clown potion, as there are still remnant negative effects. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that such acting has little effect. Personally, I'm not quite willing to play the role of a clown. But since I picked the sequence pathway, I can only bite the bullet and continue. Actually, everyone has to act like a clown at one point or another in their lives. I don't have to be so uncomfortable with the idea. I have to quickly understand a clown's core elements. As various thoughts churned in his mind, Klein suddenly took out a brass halfpence. Mostly out of habit, he divined if Maynard's death was due to supernatural influences. Maybe it's an occupational hazard. Klein shook his head and laughed. His eyes grew dark as he recited repeatedly, "John Maynard's death was due to supernatural influences." Ding! He flipped the coin as he slouched into the rocking chair. He watched its brass luster twinkle as it rotated in the air. Pack! The coin fell right into Klein's open palm, revealing the number 1/2 facing up. A negative answer. In other words, there weren't any supernatural influences involved in John Maynard's death. I guess that man died of orgasmic pleasure. The deceased shouldn't be laughed at, so I won't be using an insipid Chinese phrase to mock him. Klein put away his coin and allowed his thoughts to wander before he nearly fell asleep. Knock, knock, knock. Under the slow and rhythmic knocking, Klein tidied his clothing, put on his policeman's peak cap, and walked to the door. Just as his right palm touched the knob, a scene appeared in his mind. The bear-like Inspector Tolly was standing outside the door and pulling his collar. His expression looked disturbed and helpless. Klein turned the knob and opened the door leisurely. Inspector Tolly appeared before him as he pulled at his collar. "Sorry for making you wait so long. We've already found Madame Sharon and obtained her statement. You can return to Zutland Street. I'm really sorry for taking up your precious time." Klein didn't ask the reason for his current emotions, but he smiled and said, "Madame Sharon admitted that she was with Maynard last night?" "Yes." She said that under the influence of alcohol, she and Maynard didn't manage to control themselves. When she found out that he died of a heart attack, she was very afraid, so she fled the room after she tidied herself up. She then hid in her own guest room. We don't have enough reason to raise charges against her right now, so we had to let her go while restricting some of her freedom. We'll have to wait for the autopsy, Inspector Tolly explained in detail. Klein leaned his head sideways and smiled. "Who are you explaining this to?" Tolly shook his head and forced a bitter smile. "Oh yeah, I don't have to explain it to you. I'm just frustrated by Madame Maynard, and I started blabbering without realizing it." "Maynard's wife is back?" Klein asked in response. "Yes, unfortunately. There was something abnormal about the steam locomotive. It wasn't late." Tolly gave an affirmative answer in a joking manner. Klein didn't ask further but checked if he had all his personal belongings, before following Inspector Tolly down the stairs. "Why aren't you arresting her? She's a murderer. I want to sue her, and I want to sue all of you for negligence of duty. I'll hire the best lawyer to sue you." Harsh remarks entered Klein's ears, and he looked over subconsciously. He saw a voluptuous and fair middle-aged lady staring angrily across her. Despite having 2 young men holding her arms, she continued yelling at them. A very trendy regal gown in Backlund this year. Having frequently read the magazine, Ladies' Aesthetic, The first thought on Klein's mind was something unrelated to the situation. He then saw a few gentlemen protecting a lady behind them. The lady was in a long black dress with fair smooth skin, waterfall-like brown hair, and brown eyes. She looked as pitiful as a fawn in the woods. It made people want to protect her involuntarily. Madam Sharon. Klein suddenly thought of the porno she had starred in. He quickly lifted his right hand, covered his mouth, and coughed twice. Out of habit, he tapped his left molars twice and observed the people present with spirit vision. There's some sort of problem with Mrs. Maynard's body. The colors of her aura are thinner. From the colors of her emotions, she's definitely feeling anger and hatred, which is consistent with her outward appearance. Ha! The color of Madame Sharon's emotions are shaded in blue, which represents rational thinking and calmness. This is totally contrary to her appearance of panic and nervousness. As expected, a socialite ain't no innocent bunny. Her body is very healthy. After examining her, Klein was about to retract his gaze when he suddenly saw Madame Sharon lift her head and steal a glance in his direction. Then, she lowered her head again and put on a trembling, trepid look. If I couldn't see your emotion colors directly, I might have been fooled by your act. You should consider working as an actress. Klein lampooned. He didn't stay any longer and left Maynard's house with Inspector Tolley. They took the carriage arranged by the police station and returned to Zutland Street. After taking over the shift from the captain, he continued to stay on duty at Cheney's Gate. He took the opportunity to write a claims application. After an uneventful night, Klein returned upstairs and received the breakfast that he had requested Roseanne to buy for him. I love this pastry, he complimented. He had already passed her the money for breakfast ahead of time. Really? I can try it tomorrow then. Roseanne replied happily. The corner of Klein's lip twitched as he focused on his battle with the milk and pastry. At 25 minutes past 8, he yawned and fought back the urge to fall asleep. He arrived at the nearby shooting club. He had made an appointment with the asylum doctor, Daxter Guderian, a few days back. Bang, bang, bang. In the small shooting range, Klein and Daxter aimed at their own targets and finished their cylinder of bullets. Clink, clank. Daxter flipped and released the empty shells and examined Klein in interest. You're much more confident than before. Of course, I advanced to sequence 8. I now possess actual combat ability. Klein reflected on his own facial expression and body movements in his head and deliberately acted arrogantly. Because I only used about a month's time to master the power of my potion completely. Daxter pouted slightly and said, although that is something to be proud of, there's no need to say it all the time. Hey, as a spectator, you didn't see through my performance. From the looks of it, a clown has the power to suppress a spectator's ability. Klein smiled at his discovery and asked, how's Eugen recently? He's gone insane for real. Daxter paused and continued. I probed him with various methods. He really has gone insane. I'm considering whether to begin medicating him, to see if I can treat him. As a Sequence 7 psychiatrist, he actually pretended to be a mental patient. Even though he was giving treatments to other patients, it doesn't align with the core element of the potion's name. That was an incorrect way of using the acting method. It's no wonder that he went insane. Klein thought and said, before he went insane, did you find out who got in contact with him? Besides the doctors, patients, nurses, and odd-job workers in the asylum, there were no outsiders that had contact with him, Daxter confidently replied. Klein briefly acknowledged that as he said, how about even earlier? Is there anyone that visited him, or did he leave the asylum regularly for a period of time? In order to follow through with his initial promise, Klein never asked anything about Eugen in his first few meetings. Daxter fell into deep thought. It took him some time before he said, besides the members of the psychology alchemists, there weren't any more than 5 people that visited him. One of them came thrice. His name was L. Without Klein asking, he continued, but I heard from Eugen that L was a pseudonym. His real name was Lenivus. Chapter 175. Deduction Lenivus? That criminal who cheated both money and sex? To think that he had a connection to Eugen from the psychology alchemists. Klein froze for a moment when he heard the name. He immediately thought about the implications the name Lenivus had. He's the cheat that escaped with more than £10,000. Just to providing a clue would earn me £10. And if I help in capturing this moving treasury, I'll earn £100. He's a scum that took advantage of the bodies and feelings of innocent women. To think that he knows Hood Yujin and went to visit him 3 times at the mental asylum. Does this mean that he's connected to the Beyonder Circle, or that he's a Beyonder himself? Klein suddenly recalled the name of a potion. The Marauder Pathway Sequence 8. Swindler. These Beyonders took pleasure in swindling others. It's very possible. Klein nodded in thought. He controlled his facial expression and body language, feigning nonchalance as he asked, "Then, when was Mr. Lenivas's last visit to Hood Yujin?"
Early July.
"I would have to check the registration records of the mental asylum to give you a specific date," Daxter Guderian replied after a few seconds of thought. Lenivas's scam hadn't been exposed back in early July and he hadn't left Tinjin. Klein then asked, "Does Hood Yujin mention this person usually?"
No.
You should understand that a Sequence 7 psychiatrist would never reveal something by accident. Every word they say has been deliberated over thoroughly. It would be impossible to learn their secrets unless they have some other hidden motives. I was only able to get the telepathist formula after Hood Yujin went mad.
Oh right. Have you determined the authenticity of the formula?
Daxter expertly hid his feelings of pride toward his pathways potion. Klein laughed and replied, "It's authentic. When you need to advance, you can use that to concoct your potion without worry. We can help if the psychology alchemists are unable to provide you with the ingredients.
Also, how have you been lately?"
"Not too bad. Other than being a little worried about Hood Yujin's condition, I feel rather relaxed. I no longer have symptoms of a split personality." "You've helped me greatly in this regard," Daxter Guderian said, full of emotion. Klein wore a humble expression.
"It's only right. Let's return to the topic at hand.
Since you said that a psychiatrist would deliberate over their every word before uttering it and wouldn't easily reveal their secrets, why did Hood Yujin tell you that L is Lenivas? Was he hinting at something, or was trying to warn you of anything?" Daxter froze for a moment, then creased his brows.
"This is really weird, to think that I didn't notice this. Other than that, Hood Yujin didn't mention anything else.
Could his motive be for me to tell the upper echelons of the association about the name Lenivas should he meet with any problems?"
The association's reaction seemed strange too.
After I informed them about Hood Yujin's insanity, they did send a liaison. But after I described every detail, including Lenivas's name, there were no more replies from the upper echelons. It was like being a stone cast in the ocean.
Could this mean that they've figured something out?
A reasonable deduction. Klein took out his demon hunting bullets and stuffed them into his revolver, then took aim at the target. If we follow this deduction, Hood Yujin might have long anticipated that he would become insane or die.
And this has an untenable connection with Lenivas?
But since he already anticipated it, why didn't he ask for help from the upper echelons?
Daxter gazed blankly ahead.
He thought hard as he said, "Unfortunately, he's insane now. There's no way to effectively communicate with him now. Perhaps some kind of temptation made him choose to take the risk."
Klein made a guess.
At the same time, he felt that it was regrettable that Hood Yujin had really become a mental patient. This compromised much of the information that he might have otherwise gotten.
Sigh.
Even a dead person is better than a lunatic. I can use mediumship rituals to make the dead talk, but what can I do with a lunatic? Oh right, Madame Daly once tried to use mediumship rituals to call upon my lost memories. The theory behind the mediumship rituals seems to have been derived from the psychology alchemists. This means that I can also use the mediumship rituals on the living and create a scenario where I interact with his spirit directly using my spirit. I wonder if Hood Yujin would still be insane under those conditions. Unfortunately, I'm not advanced enough in this field, so I don't think I would be able to do it. I'll call upon the messenger and ask Madame Daly about it first. I'll see if she can provide me with any techniques. If she thinks that only she can accomplish it, then I'll tell the captain and get him to send a telegraph to Backlund to request for assistance. I'm definitely not taking this troublesome course of action just because I want to learn the technique and attempt the ritual to summon the messenger. Many thoughts ran through Klein's mind before he gradually narrowed it down to a single line of thought that could solve the problem.
Daxter Guderian approved of his guess.
Greed always makes one foolish. Even when a person knows that there's only the abyss in front of him, he'll still attempt to walk to the edge and take a peek. This is called crazily testing the limits of fate.
Klein lampooned.
Try your best to treat Hood Yujin after returning to the mental asylum. Try to keep him sober for a period of time and get some clues out of him.
Also, don't hide your worries and anxiety.
establish more connections with the psychology alchemists, and put pressure on them to solve Hood Eugen's problem. That's the most normal and reasonable reaction.
Daxter nodded seriously. I'll try my best.
Klein didn't say any more and, after some deliberation, he asked, has there been any abnormalities with Hood Eugen's body recently? For example, thin scales growing on some parts of his body? Near insanity, true insanity, and losing control were all descriptions of varying levels for a Beyonder when something was wrong with them. The least severe of the conditions were when their attitude changed as if they had become a new person, but were still capable of rational thoughts and actions.
That was near insanity.
Insanity was more severe in that the person would lose all logic, becoming a maniac and was difficult to communicate with. Those that couldn't be saved were those whose body and mind had become monsters, completely losing control. Sometimes, if the problem wasn't dealt with promptly, insanity would lead to losing control. Before this, to avoid exposing the informant within the psychology alchemists, Dunn instructed the Nighthawks not to immediately deal with Hood Eugen. Instead, they switched to surveillance to ensure that Hood Eugen didn't lose control. But if there were signs of him losing control, they would have to deal with him immediately.
Daxter shook his head and let out a bitter laugh. No, you can ease your concern.
I'm also very afraid that Hood Eugen will lose control, so I'm paying very close attention to detail. After all, I'm at the mental asylum 6 times a week. After exchanging a few more words, they left the shooting range 10 minutes apart. Klein fought back his intense desire to sleep and took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. He opened the door and saw his sister sitting on the sofa. She was neither reading nor was she fiddling with machinery parts. She was just staring blankly ahead as if she had lost her soul. Tapping his molars gently, Klein activated his spirit vision and asked, puzzled, Melissa, did something happen? She looks healthy based on the colors of her aura, not malnourished like she was before. Melissa retracted her gaze and pursed her lips, then looked at the kitchen which was producing some noise. Bella has been recommending the way that her family prepares breakfast back at home. She said that it's very delicious.
I agreed to let her try it out this morning. What method is that?
Klein had an ominous feeling. Cooking all of the leftovers in a pot, then adding water and bread, Melissa repeated softly. This is the standard recipe for food of unknown origins.
Klein pinched his forehead. And so?
We shouldn't waste food. Melissa bit her lips and nodded.
Sis, I feel like you are questioning life.
Klein cleared his throat and suppressed his desire to laugh. He then asked, where's Benson?
In the bathroom.
Melissa broke free of her daze, as her eyes regained their luster. At that moment, he heard the sounds of flushing from the bathroom. Benson came out with a newspaper in hand. My dear Klein, shall we get you a portion of breakfast?
No, I've already eaten.
Klein shook his head resolutely, feeling lucky that he arranged to meet Daxter in the morning. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten Rosen to buy breakfast for him.
How regrettable.
Otherwise, you would change your views on my culinary skills and be filled with confidence about it. Benson let out a self-deprecating laugh. At this moment, Melissa noticed something. She turned to look at Klein and said, You're back rather late today. Sis, be more innocent and lively. Don't worry about me all the time. The state you were in just now was great. Klein immediately smiled.
I have good news.
You passed the examination of the police department and can obtain an increased salary? Melissa asked without thinking. Benson also smiled and nodded. Klein grabbed his hat and stood at the edge of the living room. He said in amusement, How am I supposed to surprise you guys like that? After that, he added with a dry cough, Yes, my salary has increased several-fold. He hit his recent increment of 4 additional pounds a week. He intended to save up a small piggy bank for himself. After all, he couldn't just rely on the money in the unmarked account. Furthermore, mentioning that his salary had increased several-fold was enough to scare his siblings.
6 pounds?
Melissa exclaimed in shock, finding it bizarre. I really need to change my job. Benson stroked his hairline. With the information Klein provided him, he had been putting a lot of effort into his studies. Without waiting for Klein to speak, Melissa said with a delighted expression, In that case, after deducting our normal expenses, you'll be able to save up enough money in 2 or 3 years to meet the standards of a marriageable gentleman. Well, it was Elizabeth who told me about the standards. Klein said at a loss, amused. That's something to be considered far into the future.
Shouldn't we celebrate?
I hereby announce that from today on, Our staple food shall become white bread. After my workload decreases, we shall go try out delicacies from different restaurants. Melissa glanced at him, and as though she did not hear what Klein had said, she said, Benson and I are attending Mass at the St. Selena Cathedral. Do you want to come?
I am praising the goddess every day. Klein laughed. I need to catch up on sleep. He slept until 12:30 in the afternoon.
After he had lunch with Benson and Melissa, he continued on with his mission of searching all the houses with red chimneys. When it was late at night, he sealed his room with spirituality and prepared to try the ritual for summoning spirit guide Daly's messenger. Chapter 176. Letter for Klein. Setting up a simple ritual was as easy as breathing. Very soon, he was done preparing the ingredients, and he lit up the candle that represented himself. Looking at the flickering candlelight on the desk, Klein had an amusing thought for some baffling reason. Would this be considered holding a candlelight vigil in memory of myself? Fuck, what the hell am I thinking? He reined back his thoughts and picked up the black rotten flower powder that belonged to the domain of death and sprinkled it onto the candle. In return, he caught a whiff of a smell that was akin to formaldehyde from his previous life. Immediately after that, he dripped full moon essence oil, a favored item of the Evernight. Amidst a sizzling crackle, his surroundings suddenly became quiet, and there was a shapeless magical surge. Klein took a step back and softly recited in ancient Hermes, I. Then he changed into Hermes. I summon in my name. The spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the higher dimensional creature that a human orders, the messenger that belongs to Daily Simone.
Whoosh.
The wind wailed and the dim candlelight was tainted with a blue luster. Under its illumination, the wall behind the desk produced translucent ripples, and a creepy face surfaced. Other than its mouth, it had no eyebrows, eyes or nose. Its thick lips parted, and a long red tongue was extended. There were sharp, irregular teeth that lined its mouth. In addition, the tip of the tongue had 5 delicate fingers. They were constantly extending and retracting, as though they were waiting for a delivery.
This is Daly's messenger?
Compared to Mr. Isaac's, it's just like a child. No, I can't accurately determine their differences. Yes, one is an adult giant, and the other is a human baby. I wonder if it's due to the magical item, or if it signifies Mr. Isaac's strength. I have to re-evaluate my understanding of him. Perhaps. He's a high-sequence beyonder. Crap, I forgot. In the letter, I should have asked Madame Daly for the names of the Sequence 4 and Sequence 3 corpse collector pathway. Mr. Isaac most likely belongs to that pathway. Of course, he might have not advanced via potions. Yes, perhaps it's a gene that's passed down from his ancestors. I'll ask next time. The messenger is waiting. Klein looked at it seriously for a while and passed the neatly folded paper into the messenger's hand. Then, he watched as the hand gripped it tightly. Whoosh! The messenger retracted its tongue and swallowed the letter. The translucent, creepy, and wriggling face shrank back into the wall and disappeared. I've got to say, this magic is quite cool. Rather convenient too, but it can't be spread. Klein looked at the candlelight that had returned to normal. He shook his head and ended the ritual. Monday morning. Backlund. Empress Borough. In a hidden corner of the municipal garden built by Duke Negan, Zio Dericha with her unkempt blonde hair and Furs Wall with her languid bearing were gawking at the liaison before them in a daze. They were momentarily at a loss at which language to use for a greeting. The petite Zio, who was slightly over 1.5 meters tall, looked at the golden retriever that had extended its tongue and was wagging its tail. She smoothed out her trainee night attire and weighed her words before she said, Are you Miss Audrey's messenger? Oh my goddess, why am I asking a dog so seriously? Furs was holding a thin cigarette with her fingers as she chuckled. Maybe it's a magical creature? I've never seen a magical creature that looks so much like a dog, Zio replied in all seriousness. Susie sat down and closed her mouth. She then pointed at her belly with her paw. There was a leather pouch tied around the dog's body amidst her long golden fur. Zio looked to her left and right, making sure that there was no one watching before she quickly moved closer. She bent down and removed the pouch. Furs watched curiously when her expression suddenly turned weird. It's made of crocodile skin, and it looks like the work of the fashion designer, Mr. Sadas. She's actually using such a pouch for the transaction. In other words, it's very expensive? Zio raised the leather pouch. Furs pursed her lips tightly and nodded seriously. Zio instantly lowered her speed in an exaggerated manner. She carefully opened the zipper and took out the letter inside, as though she was carrying an antique vase in her hands. After she read it, she passed the letter to Furs. Furs burned it with her cigarette after reading it carefully. She watched as it turned into ashes and scattered onto the soil. There's no extra information provided. Zio pouted subconsciously. She took out a neatly folded paper from the pocket of her trainee night attire. She looked at Susie in an imposing manner and exhorted subconsciously. This is the investigation report for the past few days. You must pass this on to Miss Audrey Hall directly. Susie quivered and sat up straight. Her tail was wagging vigorously. Zio nodded in satisfaction, stuffed the stack of papers into the leather pouch, and tied it around Susie again. Susie howled and ran off very quickly. In the Hall family's luxurious villa, Audrey was sitting on the sofa of her own living room. She was holding a letter opener and was trying to open the letter before her. It was a letter sent by one of her brothers from the Balam Empire in the southern continent. There was a parcel that came along with the letter. At that moment, she saw Susie push open the half-closed door. The dog dashed over quickly. Susie sat on the carpet before Audrey and pawed at the leather pouch. You really are an excellent messenger. Audrey wasn't stingy with her compliments. Susie looked back at the door. It induced vibrations in the air and said softly, Your friend is very serious. When I saw her, she reminded me of the time when a hunter came to train us. She had been a complimentary gift when Count Hall bought hunting dogs. Susie, your loan is getting more and more fluent. There are just a few problems with your logic in using the language. Audrey watched as her golden retriever took off the pouch on her own and skillfully pulled open the zipper. She gave Susie a look and immediately understood. She stood up and ran to lock the door. There's no result so far, but we found that some vagrants disappeared around the Backland Bridge borough. Though we can't know for sure that it was Kalangos. Perhaps the vagrants merely changed their movement patterns suddenly. Audrey flipped through the investigation report and seriously wondered how she should reply to Zio and Furs. I'll tell Zio that as long as she can track down Rear Admiral Hurricane, Kalangos, I'll buy the sheriff potion formula for her. No, that's not friendly enough. It would make her feel an inferiority complex. Yes, I shall say, Zio, I've prepared your reward. As long as you can complete the task, £450 will be yours. Sigh, as far as the main ingredients for the telepathist formula, I've only found the Farsman rabbit's spinal fluid. I still need the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland. Glaint, Zio, and Furs have yet to find it. Audrey, cheer up. At least you've digested the spectator potion completely. Once you put together all the ingredients, you'll become a Sequence 8 Beyonder. Audrey reined in her thoughts, picked up a pen and paper, and quickly wrote a reply. She stuffed it back into the leather pouch and entrusted Susie to make another trip. She watched her golden retriever as she opened the letter that her brother had sent. She read it with a smile. My dear sister, I think you should come to the southern continent too. Come over to the colonized regions of the Balam Empire. There's abundant sunlight, fresh air, a clean environment, freshly caught seafood, various unique cultures, and the very kind and obedient Balam people who make good servants, as well as the smell of freedom. On the contrary, Backland is cold and moist, the air is bad, there's always dust, and it's always gloomy. Plus, it's highly populated, which leads to all sorts of problems. And the endless balls, banquets and salons. The social events are so boring and insipid that I wouldn't want to stay for a minute. Dear sister, I believe you share the same feeling. I'm not running away from home. I'm merely seeking my own place in life, but our brother definitely doesn't think so. He's always been a selfish person. Of course, he wouldn't be stingy with you, because you can only claim a tiny part of the family wealth, while I would be his biggest competition in the fight for the inheritance within the ranks of nobles. After all, our father is a duke who takes a long view. He definitely wouldn't be restrained by the rule that the eldest sibling will inherit the rank of nobility. As long as he feels that it's necessary, he would do anything. Just like when he sold off half the farmland and pastures to enter the banking industry, regardless of the strong opposition. I miss Backland sometimes. Mostly father, mother, and you. I miss the smile that you put on my face during those few years. You must have become the most dazzling gem in Backland, but unfortunately, I'll only be able to return after 2 years. A career is a man's pride, while the outstanding young people in the Lone Kingdom treat the world as their stage. You can tell our dear aunt that the coastal regions in the Balam Empire are very suitable for vacations, and especially suitable for her, given how her joints ache and swell in the winter. I sincerely invite her to be my guest. If you can come with her, that would be even better. I didn't send you too many gifts. They're mainly things that are rich with the traditions and styles of Balam, such as the unique yellow silk, and the ornaments that are filled with traits related to the worship of death. I remembered that you loved things regarding mysticism, so I'll look around for you. The culture here is full of mystery. After reading the letter, Audrey picked up a pen, paper, and writing board. She leaned back into the sofa, pursed her lips and wrote seriously, "My dearest Alfred, although it has been less than a year, the little girl in your memories has grown up. I don't like mysticism anymore, so you don't have to search for those kinds of things. Because it's very dangerous." Audrey puffed up her cheeks and added in her head. She had heard of too many tragedies related to mysterious objects when participating in Beyonder gatherings and from stories Zio and Furs recounted. She thought and declared excitedly, "I'm now interested in biology. Recently, I've been in awe of the rainbow salamander. Can you ask around for me and find out where I can find one of these creatures, or if they have a complete corpse that has been preserved?" Chapter 177. Sudden turn of events. Audrey stopped writing after she finished sharing some interesting news and scandals about aristocrats. She then adopted a serious pose as she recalled something. With her exceptional memory as a spectator, she arranged the information that she had received from her father's teachings, as well as the news she heard during banquets and salons, into paragraphs. After creating a draft in her head, Audrey penned, "As for the political situation in Backlund you asked about, it's not within my area of interest. I can describe it to you only based on my own impressions and the details that I happen to know. Some time ago, Father told me that after the abolishment of the Grain Act, the prices of crops were declining rapidly. The rent of farmland and pastures were also plunging, but I don't know the exact magnitude. I can only explain it to you with this example. As you know, Duke Negan is an aristocrat who owns the most land outside of the royal family. It's said that he owns more than £12 million worth of farmland, pastures, and forests. Last year, his land earned him a historic £1,300,000 in rent. But this year, it's forecast that his rent will only be £850,000, a whole £450,000 less. That's more than the entirety of the assets that I'm entitled to. Without any further explanation from me, I'm sure that my dear brother will understand the behavior of most old-fashioned nobles. They're proud of being landowners, and their income is derived mostly from rent. They place a heavy emphasis on their appearance and would maintain their current lifestyle even if they have to go into debt. They spend tens of thousands of pounds on the upkeep of their castles each year, many more thousands on clothes and jewelry, as well as their persistent hunting activities, social banquets, and the occasional lavish weddings and funerals, etc., etc. With the decrease in rent, according to my knowledge, a good portion of the nobles have met with financial difficulties. Because of this, Count Wolf has sold 84,000 ares of land in the countryside and gotten £29,000 in return. Viscount Conrad has also sold his art collection worth £55,000 to a national art gallery. Other than a few visionary nobles who had long shifted their focus to steel, coal, railroads, banks, and rubber industries, the rest of the nobles have been severely affected by the Grain Act. Let us praise our dear Count Hole. Father told me that the financial distress will loosen the control the nobles have over politics. As you can imagine, the number of ministers with blue blood will decline from the next year onward. In a bid to secure funding, the Conservative Party and the New Party have promised to confer upon anyone the noble titles as long as they donate a sufficient amount of money and lack any criminal records. Of course, the caveat is that the person who donated the money must own an amount of land befitting of a noble. One example is the rich Mr. Sindras. He purchased the lowest area of land expected of a baron, 60,000 ares, then donated £100,000 to the Carlton Club and £400,000 to the Conservative Party, and donations to charity amounting to £300,000. Finally, he succeeded in receiving conferment from His Majesty and became a highly regarded baron. I've heard that there's a price list to this, £300,000 to become a baron and £700,000 to £1 million for a hereditary baron. There is no clear price for the title of Viscount or Count, but I'm sure those are sufficiently ridiculous. This year, many nobles who are facing financial difficulties are starting to seriously consider the possibility of marriages with wealthy merchants. There have already been 3 marriages like this over the last 2 months. The betrothal gifts the noble women received are something to be envied. Also, the workers who protested the Grain Act did experience a decrease in the cost of living, but the quality of their lives has not improved. Instead, it seems to have deteriorated as the bankrupt farmers have entered the city and stolen their jobs by requesting lower wages. Thus, the wages of the laborers are dropping rapidly. I remember the day when Father asked me who I felt was the winner of the Grain Act. My dear Alfred, you must know the answer. You would definitely be able to obtain a hereditary baron title through your own efforts. Zio Dericha and Furs Wall were returning to the Backland Bridge Borough after they received Audrey's reply. Zio, with her messy blonde hair, was looking out the window of the carriage. Her eyes were bright like two burning balls of flame. She muttered the term £450 to herself repeatedly, as if reciting an incantation. Her strength and courage grew every time she repeated the term. Darkholme hasn't reported the status of the investigation today. Let's make a trip to his house. Zio suddenly turned to look at Furs. Darkholme was the leader of a triad in the Backland East Borough and had control over many beggars and thieves. Even though he looked very friendly with his chubby face that was perpetually adorned with a warm and amiable smile, Zio knew that he was a merciless scoundrel. He once broke the arm of a 13-year-old thief because the boy had hidden his profit. Unless it was necessary, Zio was unwilling to meet Darkholme, but Darkholme was one of the few people who were most familiar with the vagrants in the city. Furs pushed her slightly curly hair back behind her ear. As long as it doesn't delay my lunch. No problem. Perhaps I could treat you to an Intis feast after this week. Zio promised in complacency. Must I thank God? Furs asked as she laughed. Unlike Zio, Furs was a moderate believer of the god of steam and machinery. As they conversed, the two ladies switched to another public carriage and arrived at the Backland East Borough, and arrived at Darkholme's house. It was a terrace house located in a narrow alley. There were green plants hanging from the walls. The exterior looked relatively unkempt. Zio walked to the door, raised her right hand and knocked in a unique rhythm. The unlocked door opened with a creak following her knocks. Zio's apparently confused expression immediately turned stern, like a wary lion's. She took out a bayonet she carried with her and cautiously pushed open the door. She then slowly stepped inside. Furs also stopped looking nonchalant, having produced a dagger of unknown origins. They didn't smell any peculiar scents, but their rich experience told them that something was off. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Zio and Furs entered Darkholme's house. Then they saw a pale limb on a gas lamp, internal organs on a coffee table, as well as strips upon strips of flesh strewn on the floor and hung on the clothes rack. Pieces of bone had been stripped clean and piled up near the door. And amongst the bones was a head, its vacant eyes open. It was none other than Darkholme. His chubby face still maintained the amiable smile, as if everything was normal. Furthermore, there was no stench of blood in the house. As a former clinical doctor before becoming a best-selling author in Sequence 9 Beyonder, Furs has seen many death scenes more disgusting than this. She patted the tense Zio, who was on the brink of vomiting, as she surveyed the surroundings. Kalangos? Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos? He realized that Darkholme was investigating the missing vagrants and tracked him back to his house? Or could it be said that Darkholme had tracked him down, but ended up being caught? Zio fought back the urge to retch and said with a serious expression, "He sure lives up to his name as a merciless and crafty pirate admiral. The strangeness here also fits the description of his treasure." Crafty. Furs was suddenly alarmed as she blurted out. Could he be waiting nearby in an ambush against the mastermind behind the investigations? Zio froze for a moment before answering in a fluster. That's highly likely. He was a Sequence 6 wind-blessed, a powerful pirate with a mystical artifact, while they were just 2 Sequence 9s. This was an extremely simple and easy contrast. In the house opposite Darkholme's house, a man with a unique broad chin and dark green eyes in his 30s was standing by the window, coldly observing Zio's and Furs's opening of the door and slow entry. He was none other than Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. The black glove on his left hand twitched as if it were alive. A layer of dull gold scales appeared on its surface. Kalangos revealed a cruel and joyous expression as his dark green eyes turned pale gold and indifferent. The moment Furs realized this, she dragged Zio to the other side and avoided the area just across the main door. She then gritted her pearly white teeth and took out a bracelet that was hidden by her sleeves. This silver bracelet had 3 dark green, coarse stones which showed signs of burn marks and were rough and uneven. Furs pulled out one of the stones and let out a low growl in ancient Hermes. Door. She grabbed onto Zio Dericha tightly as the stone released a faint blue glow. The figures of the two ladies turned indistinct, nearly invisible. They saw many forms they found difficult to describe. There were even transparent objects that didn't seem to exist. They saw different colors, lustrous splendors which seemed to possess immense knowledge. They had entered the mysterious spirit world. In this strange world that stood distinct from reality, Furs proceeded in a particular direction while pulling Zio along. Seconds later, they exited their indistinct states and returned to reality, to Backlund. But they were no longer at Darkholm's house, but instead arrived at an empty cemetery. Kalangos, who was wearing his scaled glove, silently appeared at the door of Darkholm's house. He swept the interior with his cold gaze. He froze for a moment, then creased his brows as he muttered to himself, "Traveler?
In the cemetery. What are we going to do next?"
Furs panted, sensing their predicament and feeling a lingering sense of fear. The bracelet was a mystical item she had received along with the formula for apprentice and its corresponding materials back during a fortuitous encounter of hers. Other than causing her to hear strange faint murmurings during the full moon every month, it posed no threat. There were originally 5 stones on the bracelet, each stone allowing her to traverse through the spirit world, technically allowing her to teleport. But now, there were only 2 stones left. Zio calmed herself down and nodded solemnly. "First notify Miss Audrey, then we call the police." Chapter 178. The subsequent ideas, call the police?
Furs Wall repeated in surprise.
To Beyonders, lodging a police report seemed to be something of another world. Zio paced back and forth as she tugged her coarse blonde hair. The scene of Darkholm's death is harrowing and creepy. As long as the police aren't blind, they would definitely pass the case on to the mandated punishers, the Nighthawks, the Machinery Hive Mind, or the Special Department of the military. When that happens, we can leak some more information and let them know that the murderer is Kalangos. At that point, the entire city will be chasing after him. Our goal is only to look for Kalangos, not to capture him. With the help of so many Beyonders, things would become much simpler and safer. Once Kalangos panics and makes a mistake, it would be our chance to claim our bounty. Haha, I'm referring to the discovery of his whereabouts. Zio laughed dryly and looked at the appalled Furs. Do you think that the only way I know to deal with problems is by charging into them head first? The difference between us and Kalangos is as vast as the Desi Bay. Furs nodded slowly and said, "Your understanding of yourself is absolutely right. You've done too many things of a similar nature. Hence, the losses that you've suffered is sufficient for you to advance to Sequence 8. Luckily, you're still rational enough regarding this matter." Zio lowered her head to look at her bayonet. She thought for a moment and said, "I have to be honest. I clearly sensed the approach of death earlier. Kalangos was no doubt nearby. That was an aura evil enough to destroy us at any time. That triggered an instinctual response in me." Furs wore her silver bracelet that had 2 stones left and thought seriously. "I agree with your idea. Let's inform Miss Audrey first and lodge the police report after." Yes, regardless if it was Darkholm or his underlings who found Kalangos' traces, we could continue to investigate with that approach and find out Kalangos' activity range and the location of his residence. Zio creased her slim blonde eyebrows and said, "But Kalangos would definitely not remain in the same place. Even as one of the 7 pirate admirals, even if he had the assistance of a mystical artifact, Kalangos had to be extremely careful in Backlund. Even Nast, the king of the 5 seas, had once encountered disaster here and was nearly caught. No, what I meant was, to surmise or confirm the purpose of Kalangos' visit to Backlund based on the clues. Once we know what he's trying to do, no matter how he disguises himself or what tricks he pulls, he'll be exposed to us in the end. Then, our mission would be accomplished," Furs explained in detail. 2 years of novel writing experience tells me that things would become simple once we grasp the crux of the matter. Zio looked at her best friend in shock. She couldn't believe the woman had just made such a logical statement. "I'm different from you. I'm merely too lazy to think, while you think with your muscles." Furs pursed her lips, leaned her head sideways, and smiled. "Teasing me doesn't make you smarter." Zio tried to smooth out her few strands of blonde hair that was sticking out. "All right, let's head over to Empress Burrow and tell Miss Audrey about this." Furs nodded faintly and said, "So, what's our emergency contact method with Miss Audrey?" Zio was momentarily put at a loss. She looked afar at the tombstone as she said, "She told me that pet dog of hers we saw earlier walks herself at least 5 times a day.
Well, the next walk should be after lunch. In other words, we have to loiter around suspiciously outside Count Hall's luxurious manor? The corner of Furz's lips twitched. Zio suddenly looked sideways and revealed an obsequious smile. Furz, or would you prefer to just sneak in? I don't think that would be difficult for you. It's what you're good at. A hereditary count for centuries, one of the most influential parliament members in the House of Lords, the largest shareholder of Varvat Bank, the fourth largest shareholder of Backland Bank, the special consultant of the Royal Bank of Loan, the third largest shareholder of Suchit Bank in the Intis Republic, the second largest shareholder of Constant Coal and Steel Consortium, and so on. These are the titles of Miss Audrey's father. Zio, use your brain. How could a man like that not employ any beyonders? Would he not have any prized collections? This is different from those destitute viscounts and barons. Furz replied in exasperation. I swear in the name of God, if I were to sneak in, I would be discovered and caught within 5 minutes. Zio nodded continuously in agreement. Let's wait for the golden retriever then. With that said, she led the way. After she took a few steps forward, she spoke with her back facing Furz. Well, I will compensate you for your losses and the damages in the future. I'm referring to the stone, of course. Listening to that, the corner of Furz's lips lifted and she said, I was saving myself. And Zio, you're going the wrong way. God, if you were an apprentice and ended up becoming a traveler in the future, it would be a disaster. Outside Count Hall's luxurious manor, Zio and Furz hid behind an Intis parasol tree and secretly observed their target building in silence, watching the people walking to and fro. After God knows how long, they finally saw the golden retriever come out from a hidden hole under the wall. It pricked up its ears and looked to its left and right, appearing very cautious. Just as Susie started taking its walk happily, a black male dog popped up from nowhere. It fawned on Susie and started running around in circles. This is the first time I'm seeing a dog show such a human-like reaction. Just how much does it hate that black dog? Zio sighed. She could tell from Susie's gaze and facial expression that there was obvious detest. Furz smiled and said, It's just like encountering a rash, disgusting and persistent lecher. Seeing Susie attempt to speed up to escape the black dog's pursuit, Zio stood up to administer justice. My ruling is for you to leave her alone. Zio shouted with a mask of solemnity. The black dog was taken aback and immediately scampered away with its tail between its legs. Susie let out a breath of relief and slowed down. It barked politely and wagged its tail. That was close. I nearly said thank you to them. The golden retriever thought in joy. That would have been a very awkward situation. A melodic tune slowly came to a halt as Audrey picked up the latest intelligence Zio and Furz had delivered and read it with knitted brows. She closed the piano cover and stood up elegantly. She paced back and forth in her piano room and considered her next course of action. Kalangos is a very dangerous man. If Zio and Furz continued investigating, they might end up in danger. It might even expose me. Yes, I should just proceed according to their suggestion. Oh yeah, it's another 2 hours until the Tarot Club. I wonder what Mr. Fool would suggest? If he's still not interested, I'll discuss it with the hanged man carefully. Audrey gradually calmed herself down. This was the first time she had encountered, or perhaps was described as being placed in such a perilous situation. There was already 1 death. 3 in the afternoon. Audrey's vision recovered from a crimson and blurry state before seeing the boundless gray fog that didn't belong to reality, the lofty palace that looked like the home of a giant, the long ancient mottled bronze table, and the fool who was always engulfed by a thick layer of fog. Lastly, she saw the hanged man and the sun. At that moment, Audrey's tense and anxious emotions seemed to relax. She felt so safe, so calm. I'm participating in the Tarot Club that doesn't belong in the material world, and I'm dealing with Mr. Fool who's nearly a god. Kalangos and I are on different levels. Audrey sat in an upright position proudly. She lifted her chin slightly and greeted cheerfully. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Good afternoon, Mr. Hanged Man. Good afternoon, Mr. Sun. After they greeted one another, Klein saw that Miss Justice was indicating her desire to speak. Therefore, he nodded faintly to express his permission. Honorable Mr. Fool, I wonder if your adorer has received the compensation of £300? Audrey asked, holding back her urge to talk about Kalangos while she showed concern over her leader's adorer. Klein smiled and said, I didn't pay close attention to this matter. But as my adorer didn't request for additional help, I suppose he has already received it. Yes, I've checked multiple times. There are £300 lying in my anonymous bank account. Klein added in his head happily. That's great. Audrey relaxed and looked across her. Mr. Hanged Man, there's been progress regarding Kalangos. Alger suddenly sat up straight. He couldn't hide his excitement as he asked, "Where is he?" Unfortunately, he noticed our investigations just after we discovered his tracks. He killed one of the personnel involved. Audrey repeated the highlights of Zio's and Furz's story and explained their follow-up plan in detail. Alger nodded faintly and said, "I'll pay close attention." Then, he turned to the side and looked towards the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Under the vacant gaze of the son, Derek, who listened but didn't understand anything, he said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, if I were to find out Kalango's true intention and the very important and magical item that he intends to obtain, please allow me to recite your name and inform you through the ritual." He didn't repeat his request for the fool's adorer to provide him assistance. As he brought it up before and the fool had given his answer, there was no need to harp on the topic. Otherwise it might provoke the god. Hence, Alger made it clear that his intention was only to report his findings. If the final temptation was sufficient, he believed that Mr. Fool's adorer would definitely appear. That works. Audrey widened her eyes. I should have asked for the right to report as well. I might be able to gain Mr. Fool's guidance occasionally. She thought with regret. Under everyone's gaze, Klein leaned back into his chair and nodded faintly. He replied slowly, "You may." Chapter 179. Praising Mr. Fool. Alger heaved a sigh of relief when he heard the fool's answer. He lowered his head and humbly said, "Please allow me to thank you in advance. That's because I'm also curious. Curious about the item Kalangos is searching for. I want to know about the item that can allow a Sequence 6 Windblessed to have the strength of a Sequence 4. I'm also curious about what a pirate admiral is going to do in Backland." Klein smiled, maintaining his profound posture. "It's not like I've promised to provide assistance after I hear your prayers," he emphasized in his heart. But now, he was a lot more confident than before. Now, he had actual allies and the mysterious Mr. Azek who was currently in Backland. If it was absolutely necessary, Klein was willing to use the bronze whistle to enlist the help of Azek. Of course, he definitely wouldn't mention the Tarot Club. He would probably say he got information from some random source. There were still two problems that existed in this matter. First, Klein was only limited to a cooperative relationship with Azek. It wasn't necessarily the case that Azek would provide assistance unless he was interested in what Kalangos was doing or the mystical item that he was after. Second, Klein was unsure of just how powerful Azek was. Even if he had made the assumption that Azek was a high sequence beyonder, he had to consider the fact that his memory loss might have weakened his abilities. After all, knowledge was usually equated with power, and the lack of knowledge would definitely diminish Azek's power. If that was the case, Klein couldn't guarantee that Azek could deal with Kalangos, especially with the latter wielding the creeping hunger. Klein was afraid that he would be placing Azek in danger, so he was unwilling to trouble Azek unless he absolutely had to. Now that I think about it, Mr. Azek's terrifying messenger can be summoned with the bronze whistle. No, that thing doesn't look like a messenger at all. It could take the role of an evil boss. So, even if Mr. Azek cannot beat the creeping hunger-augmented Kalangos, he should be able to defend himself easily and have enough power left to save the Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and her partners. Klein shifted his posture as he thought, still leaning against the back of his chair. He propped his right leg over his left. The Hanged Man. Alger looked at the fool and spoke once again. "I'm about to receive a batch of pages from Emperor Rosel's diary. I believe that I can present them to you in the next gathering, or the gathering after that." According to the arrangement of the Church of the Lord of Storms, Pritz Harbor was under the jurisdiction of the Backland Diocese. Thus, Alger could enter the capital and wait for Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos to show himself under the guise of reporting about his previous voyage. Backland had been the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms until the end of the last epoch, having shifted their holy altar to Pasu Island only after the establishment of the Lone Kingdom. Regardless, the status of the Church of the Lord of Storms in Backland was second only to the headquarters of the 7 great churches. One could imagine the information the Church of the Lord of Storms held. Under these circumstances, Alger was confident that he would be able to collect pages of Emperor Rosel's diary in the name of research. After all, they were indecipherable at present. Klein allowed joy to color his tone, as he said with a gentle nod, "Very good. What he was really feeling right now was a mix of joy and worry.
He was happy that he could see several pages of Emperor Roselle's diary soon. They might contain a lot of useful information, but he was also worried about what he had to give the hanged man in return. After all, no one knew if the hanged man would be interested in the contents of the diary, or if the content was valuable enough. Even a seer is unable to determine that in advance.
Must I really let my adorer help him? Klein gave a silent sigh.
Audrey Hall hurriedly spoke up when she saw the conversation between the hanged man and the fool end. Honorable Mr. Fool, may I recite your name and inform you using a ritual should I receive any timely and useful information?
Timely. Look, Miss Justice's choice of words is so refined.
Compared to her, you are too vulgar, the hanged man. Klein nodded slightly, saying past the fog, you may.
Great. Audrey secretly clenched her fists.
At the same time, Klein turned to look at the son, Derek Berg, who had been silently listening to their conversations. He spoke, his tone was peaceful. The same goes for you as well. Yes, Mr. Fool.
Derek lowered his head.
The majestic palace was silent for a few seconds before Audrey spoke. I need the complete pituitary gland of a rainbow salamander.
One of the main ingredients of the telepathist potion?
Hanged man Alger nodded slightly as if he was contemplating.
I don't have it. To be honest, I've only seen this creature in textbooks.
The son, Derek, heard the term automatically translated to him as Phantom Netherdrake.
What kind of textbook would discuss a supernatural creature? How envious.
I can only get information like that at a Beyonder gathering, through word of mouth, or through a crumpled piece of paper. There's no system in place, and my search for knowledge lacks organization.
I'll find a way to trade for the son's textbook in the future.
Oh, he was interested in the formula for the Bard potion.
Audrey thought, a little envious.
At that moment, Alger looked at the fool, then retracted his gaze. He then looked opposite him and said in thought, I might have a way of obtaining the complete pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander. Without waiting for Audrey to speak, he added on, but it's under the premise that Kalangos is found. When the time comes, the complete pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander would be equivalent to the extra compensation that I owe you. Miss Justice, you might not know, but these creatures are nearly extinct, and we can only find traces of them in primitive islands in the Sea of Fog, the Berserk Sea, or the Sonia Sea.
Not many people have the coordinates to these islands.
If you're interested, we can make a deal, for I am one of the few who knows how to get there.
I'm also interested in those primitive islands.
Klein silently listened to their conversation. Thinking about the extinction of the rainbow salamander, he suddenly recalled the joke he cracked with old Neil, the Dragons and Giants Protection Association. He let out a sigh in his heart.
Audrey became thrilled after hearing that.
She fought back her emotions as she said, I once dreamed of going on a voyage in search of these primitive islands to take in the history. My goddess, the Tarot Club is too powerful, too wonderful. To be able to recruit a member who has the coordinates of the primitive islands. Praise Mr. Fool. Audrey couldn't maintain her spectator state as a smile crept across her face.
Primitive islands?
Klein froze for a moment, then thought about a page of Emperor Roselle's diary that he had seen, the one where the Emperor described himself as a pirate king. He said that he discovered an unnamed island with many supernatural creatures when he and his 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were traversing the Sea of Fog on an unsafe sea route.
Could that be the so-called primitive island?
How unfortunate, the great Emperor didn't include any coordinates in his diary. Perhaps the information will be in some future pages, but as of now, I haven't received any pages of his diary in chronological order.
Klein was filled with regret and anticipation.
The son Derek was already confused by the terms Sea of Fog, Berserk Sea, Sonia Sea, Primitive Island, etc. He felt more and more certain that Miss Justice and Mr. Hangman belonged to a different world than he did. After collecting herself for a few seconds, Audrey asked curiously, does the near extinction of the rainbow salamander mean that the spectator pathway will be severed soon?
No, there will definitely be substitute materials.
Alger gave a definite answer.
What substitute materials are there?
Audrey's eyes brightened as she asked. Alger shook his head, replying without revealing certain profound truths, I don't know. Perhaps the members of the psychology alchemists might know.
Then how can you be so sure that there will be substitute ingredients?
Audrey didn't understand. Alger laughed and said, you will understand in time.
Or do you have something to trade for the information right now?
I guess I'll wait.
Audrey pouted and sighed.
She also dismissed the idea of asking Mr. Fool. There's no use in me knowing for the time being. The Hanged Man will definitely ask about something regarding Rear Admiral Hurricane, and I cannot be dragged too deep into that matter. She suddenly felt like praising her intellect. But what she never expected was that Mr. Fool was feeling very disappointed at that moment. Klein was rather curious about the secrets which Alger's words held. Unfortunately, Miss Justice, who was the best assist all this while, didn't choose to go through with the transaction. No matter what method they chose to perform a transaction, the contents of the deal couldn't be hidden from the owner of the fog. Well, even if the rainbow salamander is nearing extinction, the psychology alchemists are still giving out formulas listing it as an ingredient instead of providing a substitute. Does this mean that the psychology alchemists are in possession of the coordinates of certain primitive islands? Or could they be working together with an organization that has the coordinates? Klein wondered. After the end of the transaction discussions, Klein looked around, then turned to the sun. He asked in a gentle tone, "Does the City of Silver still believe in gods?" Klein was merely an official member of the Nighthawks and had no access to deeper mysticism knowledge. An example would be sacrificial rituals. Thus, in order to refine his understanding of performing sacrificing dedicated to himself, to move materials in the mysterious space above the gray fog, as a sequence 8, Klein needed to learn it as soon as possible from other sources. He came up with 3 methods after continuous consideration. First, he was going to ask Spirit Guide Daly, who was adept at ritualistic magic whilst also being a deacon. But this might invite suspicion from her. Thus, Klein could only patiently wait for an opportunity. Second, he could ask Mr. Azek, but Klein couldn't guarantee that he would be able to recall the knowledge in this area. Third, he was going to use a roundabout way to ask Sun, who lived in the City of Silver. Klein already had an idea of how he was going to do it while effectively maintaining his image. Whatever he asked would be tied to the gods. Derek replied in a respectful tone, "We still believe in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God." Chapter 180. A smart person always overthinks. Upon hearing the fool's question, Audrey perked up her ears and entered her spectator state. She waited for the sun to answer. She had always been curious about where the City of Silver was and what was so special about that place, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. It touched upon his privacy after all. At that moment, Mr. Fool was asking personally. It was like finishing the first volume of an outstanding detective novel she had been reading for a long time, and she finally had the chance to buy the next volume. The Sun's answer didn't disappoint her. They didn't believe in the mainstream 7 orthodox deities, nor did they believe in death as the southern continent did. They also didn't believe in the hidden existences, evil gods or devils, primordial demonis, hidden sage, dark side of the universe, chained god, or the true creator, which the Hanged Man had told her before. The City of Silver is really special. They actually worship the creator himself. This is the primordial worship that Mr. Hanged Man described, right? The description of omnipotence is a little strange. Audrey stole a glance at the Hanged Man subconsciously, and realized that he was nodding slightly. Klein wasn't surprised at all. He purposely chuckled and asked in reply, "Even though he abandoned you?" "Abandoned? The creator abandoned the City of Silver?" Alger was shocked. Suddenly when he made the connection regarding a particular term. The Forsaken Land of the Gods. In the confidential information of the Church of the Lord of Storms, at the security clearance level that Alger, who was captain, equivalent to the bishop level, could access, the Forsaken Land of the Gods had always only been a name with no actual description. However, it clearly pointed towards the end of the Sonia Sea. From what he knew, even the cardinals at the core of the church had no idea what the Forsaken Land of the Gods represented. But only the leader of the church, the proxy of the Lord of Storms, knew something about the situation and seemed to be taking charge of the hidden mission to look for the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Alger had once made a bold guess when he equated the true creator's holy residence, which was promoted by the Aurora Order, with the Forsaken Land of the Gods. But, unfortunately, the fool hadn't confirmed his guess, so he couldn't be sure. Now, he was shocked and surprised to find that the Tarot Club member using the sun as his code name was very likely from the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Mr. Fool knew where the Forsaken Land of the Gods was all this time, and he could pull someone from there to be a member of the gathering. This is a hidden place that the Church of the Lord of Storms has been trying to find to no avail. Alger looked at the fool who was seated in the seat of honor at the end of the ancient long bronze table in horror. He could only see that he was leaning back in his chair in silence, engulfed by the thick fog.
Audrey wasn't particularly moved about it.
The only time that she had heard about the forsaken land of the gods was from the hanged man's question.
She wasn't particularly interested, so she failed to associate it to anything from what Mr. Fool said earlier.
The City of Silver has the legend about being abandoned by the Creator.
Mr. Hanged Man seems to be deeply affected. What is he amazed and afraid of?
Audrey nodded in puzzlement as she remembered the details of the moment.
Yes, we believe that we will regain the Lord's favor in the end.
Perhaps it will be on the day the sun rises again. Derek Berg answered in an uncertain tone.
We were once ruled by the giant's royal family, and we worshipped the giant King Ormer.
Later, we were saved by the Lord and we will never betray the Lord again.
Ruled by the giant's royal family. It really is ancient, but it doesn't seem to match. Alger, who had guessed at something, suddenly recalled the description about the second epoch in the hidden chapter of the Book of Storms. The second epoch was also known as humanity's dark epoch. At the time, the sky, ocean, and land were ruled over by dragons, giants, elves, mutants, devils, phoenixes, demonic wolves, and dead spirits. But in the end, the Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom led humanity into defeating the supernatural creatures and ushered in the beginning of the third epoch, the glorious era, which was later known as Cataclysm. Giant King Ormer. Klein repeated the name in silence. In various legends and myths, it was a great existence on par with the deities. Even now, there were still some places that worshipped him. Even the most famous and most expensive grape wine in the Intis Republic was named after Ormer. It was said that the giant king particularly fancied grape wine, which was like blood.
Considering the fact that the Church of the God of Combat is in control of the complete pathway of the warrior, which once belonged to the giants, can I assume that Ormer was the ancient god of combat?
Klein guessed. He nodded deliberately but didn't think any further about it. He then asked calmly, "Do you still offer sacrifices to this omnipotent god?" "Yes, we still do. But since the day we were abandoned, we have never gotten any response." Derek's voice had a hint of unconcealed pain. Klein leaned against the back of his chair leisurely. He half closed his eyes and said, "Describe the process of your offering ritual in detail. Does Mr. Fool want to figure out the truth behind the City of Silver's abandonment? Or does he want to determine if the Creator still exists?" Alger suddenly felt a shock through his body and he quivered. Not only was he afraid, but he was also excited too. This was because he felt he was being made privy to the secrets between deities. That made him feel like he had been elevated to a whole new level. I've been chasing after power, after strength. Didn't I do it to achieve this kind of feeling? Alger leaned back, lifted his chin, and got carried away with his thoughts. Mr. Hanged Man's mental state doesn't seem to be normal. Audrey looked at him with pity. She finally understood that there might be some sort of shocking secret behind the communication between Mr. Fool and the Sun, which led to the Hanged Man's loss of composure. After the Kalango's commission is over, I'll pay the price to get information about what Mr. Hanged Man learned today. I wonder if he would be willing to. Audrey thought in anticipation, yet was still a little worried. Derek didn't notice the weight that was hanging on his answer as he replied frankly, "We build opulent altars covered in the Lord's symbol. Every time we receive a bumper black-faced grass harvest, we hold a sacrificial ritual. We use the monsters we capture in the depths of the darkness to use as sacrificial offerings. After we recite God's honorable title and the necessary prayers, we dance for him and then kill the monsters, to let their spirituality and tainted blood dye the entire altar. If we haven't caught any monsters, then we use a sinner on the lowest floor in the City of Silver prison instead. Then we turn the very first batch of black-faced grass into food and serve it before the Lord. In the end, we sing praises in unison and end the ritual. Since I was planning to offer a sacrifice to myself, I'm not picky about time, and the altar can be as simple as possible. The most important part would be to open a channel with the aid of the monster's spirituality or the blood containing beyonder powers to complete the sacrifice offering. Of course, this is under the premise that one will receive a response. How extravagant. Klein used his mysticism knowledge to analyze every step of the sacrificial ritual in the City of Silver before finally saying, "What are the corresponding prayers? What language do you recite them in?" Derek was also looking forward to this, so as to gain hints from Mr. Fool on how to shake off the curse, so he recalled it carefully and answered, "We use Jotun, which is also our common language. The corresponding prayers are, your devoted believers pray for your attention. We pray for you to take their offerings. We pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom.
Klein listened in silence and intentionally let the engulfing fog slowly swirl around him. He nodded as though deep in thought and remained silent. As for what he learned from it, he obviously wouldn't share it. Alger found it very normal. How could the secrets of a deity be revealed directly to a mortal? Derek also steeled his resolve to quickly grow in power, so that he could obtain something that could garner Mr. Fool's interest in exchange for his guidance. After some more communication, Klein ended the gathering. He watched Justice's, the Hanged Man's, and the Sun's figures vanish before him. He looked down and saw the boundless gray fog and crimson stars that seemed eternally immutable. However, after he advanced to sequence 8, he realized that he could connect even more stars. In other words, he could pull in more members.
At least 2. Klein nodded indiscernibly. He wasn't in a hurry to add new members. He planned to act as he had before. He would first wait and observe. If Justice and the Hanged Man had any recommendations, he could assess them first. What I saw the last few times was when the Sun was praying. There was a clear crystal ball before him, but ever since I pulled him into the world above the gray fog, that crystal ball has never appeared again. Does the prerequisite needed to pull people in through the connection of the Crimson Star have something to do with having a special item around them? Or does every Crimson Star correspond to an item in reality, which, when it's connected successfully, it would return to the world above the gray fog? I wonder if Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man were the same. Let's just assume that's the case. In that case, if people without this special item were to recite, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck, and allow me to hear their prayers," would I be able to pull them in? I can give it a try in the future.
Klein didn't stay any longer. He wrapped himself with spirituality and stimulated a descent, leaving behind the lofty palace, the ancient table, and the 22 high-backed chairs which sat immutably above the gray fog. He had mastered the overflowing power of the clown potion and eliminated the corresponding negative effects. Therefore, he wanted to try the ritual to summon himself. I wonder what I'll conjure this time. Klein thought in anticipation and fear as he fell through the mad ravings. Chapter 181. Different state. Klein didn't hurry to dispel the wall of spirituality when he returned to his room. Instead, he expertly took out a candle infused with sandalwood and placed it in the middle of his desk. He then followed the steps for the ritual, lighting up the candle with his spirituality and scattering essences, extract, and herb powder herbs symbolizing good luck and mystery. He saw the flame alternate between being dull and bright as he took in the fragrance of peace and harmony. Klein took 2 steps back and looked at the candle on the table. He then shouted in the language of the giants, "I." After a pause, he switched to Hermes. "I summon in my name the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." At that moment, the flickering flame fused itself with the harmonious scent to form an illusory vortex, a vortex that manically absorbed the spirituality. After Klein finished reciting the incantations, the vortex stabilized to become a palm-sized circle of grayish-white fog. After observing the fog, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise without hesitation. He returned to the world above the fog, and as he expected, he saw ripples of light spreading from his high-backed chair, accentuating the mysterious aura of the weird symbol, the pupilless eye and partially contorted lines on his chair. He took in a deep breath and calmed his soul down using cogitation before extending his hand toward the target. At that moment, he heard the incantations that he had just recited. He saw the surging spirituality and the rippling light fuse to form an illusory door. Compared to the previous time, the door was now completely formed and was etched full of mysterious patterns. The patterns were the same as the symbol on the back of the fool's chair, a symbol made up of the pupilless eye and the partially contorted lines. As he looked at the door, Klein focused his mind and willed the door open. Without warning, ripples formed in the eternally immutable grayish-white fog and the majestic palace, like a stone being cast in a peaceful pond. The ripples spread in the direction of the door of summoning. The sound of heavy scraping sound caused by friction could suddenly be heard. A slit appeared in the heavy mysterious door. Beyond it, one could faintly see an immensely dark world, filled with countless indescribable, transparent figures. There were also streaks of different colors, lustrous splendor that harbored infinite knowledge. At that moment, Klein felt an unimaginable, irresistible attractive force coming from beyond the door. He couldn't help but get pulled towards it. Damn! Are you not giving me the choice? Just as he had that alarming thought, His body went through the slit and vanished into the darkness behind the door. The dizzying, maniacal roars gradually died down. Klein finally came to his senses. He saw a young man in front of him. The man was wearing an old shirt, had black hair, brown eyes, and average-looking facial features. The man had an average build, was a little skinny, but his frame seemed to hide considerable power. He also had the obvious demeanor of a scholar.
Isn't that me? Klein wasn't a stranger to scenes like this. He encountered something like this every time he looked in the mirror. He nodded indiscernibly and surveyed his surroundings. He saw his bed with a white bedsheet draped over it. He saw his half-top hat, tuxedo, and black windbreaker hanging on his clothes rack. He saw a bookshelf with quite a number of books, his neat table that only had one candle on it. He saw the candle flame emitting a grayish-white glow. And now, he was floating in front of the palm-sized circle of grayish-white fog. So, have I really summoned myself? It feels a little like an out-of-body experience. But there's also something a little different. Klein looked at the physical body belonging to him, toward his blank vacant eyes and slipped into deep thought. But he could finally confirm one thing. It was only his soul, also known as his spirit body in mysticism, that headed to the world of fog. The exterior appearance was that of the astral projection. It's no wonder that I can directly see the astral projection surface of Justice, the Hanged Man, and the sun and confirm whether they were beyond us or not when I was in the world above the fog. I could also guess their sequence numbers.
My physical body seems to be under some form of protection, perhaps from the power of the ritual, for me to stand with such stability and not lose my balance.
It should be the same for Miss Justice and the others. Klein slowly got used to the current situation and started to analyze the conditions of both his physical body and soul. He retracted his gaze and tried to move his soul, now fused with powers from the mysterious space. Whoosh! A cold wind started to blow, as it spiraled around the room. Klein savored the sensation of flying, joyfully making circles in the room. I can also take on the role of a messenger in this city now. I wonder if I can carry physical items with me. He collected himself and stopped. He floated in the air and experimented with his other abilities. He tried to grab a notebook from his bookshelf, but his hand passed through it. It feels a little sticky. It's not like moving through air.
I might be able to grab it after I become more powerful and able to better utilize the mysterious powers of the world above the gray fog.
Klein once again tried grabbing a single piece of paper but to no avail.
After more than 10 seconds of deliberation, he flew toward the clothes rack and extended his transparent hand into the pocket of his black windbreaker.
He touched the slumber charms and the requiem charms that he replenished from a successful claim. They were objects infused with his own spirituality, different from ordinary objects in supernatural terms. Thus, Klein wanted to see if he could carry them about. His palm once again went through the charms, but he could clearly feel their existence. He felt the intertwining of spirituality, but he didn't have enough strength to pick them up. Of course, another explanation was that there wasn't enough spirituality within the charms to achieve a strong resonance with his current state. The spirituality isn't strong enough,
Klein thought as he moved towards the other pocket. That pocket stored the flaring sun charms that he made with the stolen power of the divine blood and his own spirituality. A warm sensation quickly spread all over his body, making his form turn more stable and his thoughts clearer. He could take the thin gold piece out of his pocket. In the mirror in his room, the charm seemed to float out of the pocket on its own accord, similar to the descriptions in ghost stories.
I can move flaring sun charms. I can also create sound using my spirituality. So I do have certain abilities in this state. Klein flew toward the mirror and stopped in front of it.
He saw that only the thin gold piece was reflected.
Other than that, it was only the furniture and darkness in the room caused by the drawn curtains.
After a few seconds of consideration, he placed the flaring sun charm onto the bed before returning to the front of the mirror.
He wanted to see if he could move through the mirror. His vision turned dark. Klein's vantage point suddenly changed.
He saw the room that was reflected in the mirror, the furniture that was accentuated by the weak sources of light.
It made him feel as though he was hiding in an obscure corner, peeping into a tiny portion of the room. I really can go through the mirror. But this is only an ordinary item which doesn't lead to some mysterious and strange world.
Klein nodded and charged forward, once again returning to his room.
The success of carrying the flaring sun charm gave him immense confidence. Hence, he attempted grabbing something else. Mr. Azek's copper whistle. The moment he touched the ancient and intricate object,
He felt his spirituality expanding and freezing. His illusory eyes turned into dark, burning flames. It feels like I have gotten a little more powerful. My form is like a wraith's but without the strong sense of vengeance. Klein projected his current appearance by calming his mind. This was one of the abilities of a clown. Mr. Azek's copper whistle is truly fascinating. He nodded, noticing that he could now pick up pieces of paper with certain weights. He could also pick up his slumber charms. How unfortunate. I can carry the silver ritual dagger, but the revolver is too heavy. Klein concluded his experiments and turned to see if he could use any spells in this state. After serious tests, he concluded that he could conjure 2 spells. The first being a formless howl could shake the souls of his target, and the second was inducing a state akin to freezing via contact with a target.
Klein came to a satisfied stop. He looked out the oriel window, towards the sunlight, and street covered by the curtain. I wonder if I can move about during the day in this state.
He muttered as he floated towards the window. He then carefully lifted the curtain, creating a slit and allowing a small amount of sunlight to pass through the wall of spirituality and into the room. Under the radiant sunlight, Klein felt his soul boil with a black fog. His powers were also being drained away, bit by bit. He quickly released his grip, allowing the curtain to block the light. I can't. Klein thought for a moment, then placed his gaze on the flaring sun charm on the bed. I wonder if the effect would be the same if I'm augmented with the divine blood of the eternal blazing sun? He floated toward the bed and tried to grab the thin piece of gold. But just as he touched the charm, the warm pure feeling formed a stark contrast with his burgeoning cold spirituality. It was like an existential conflict between fire and water. Sizzle! He tossed the piece of gold away as if he had been burned. The power of Mr. Azek's copper whistle cannot inhabit my soul at the same time as the flaring sun charm. Klein understood as he set the copper whistle down. He felt his spirituality shrink, and the black flames in his eyes extinguished. In this state, both the spells I can use have been weakened. After another round of experimentation, Klein grabbed the flaring sun charm, once again feeling the stabilizing and warm purifying effects the charm had on his spirit body. He returned to the window and cautiously moved through the curtain. The sunlight only felt warm on his body, but it didn't inflict any harm. Not bad. Klein let out a mixed smile. He made his way past the wall of spirituality and cautiously flew out of the house with the intention of conducting more experiments. Chapter 182. Wanderer Klein. The weather in Tingen turned from refreshing cool to a bitingly chill in early September. However, the sunlight at 3 or 4 in the afternoon was still warm and soothing. Klein went through the wall of spirituality and the oriel window. He floated in the air outside of his bedroom as he overlooked the people and carriages shuttling to and fro Daffodil Street. Just then, there was a man in a grey labor uniform who suddenly lifted his head and looked over. Klein panicked and wanted to hide, but he couldn't find any suitable cover. When he didn't see anything to hide behind, he started to sneak back into his house. However, from the corner of his eye, he saw the man earlier merely glanced over the window. Then his gaze followed a flying sparrow, but unfortunately, he lost sight of it. In Tingen, birds could occasionally be seen. Phew! I forgot that an ordinary person wouldn't be able to see me. Klein let out a breath of relief and felt that he had yet to get used to the situation. As he grew more confident, he flew lower and went to a nearby spacious street where he floated above people's heads. As he drew closer, Klein immediately realized that his vision was the same as his spirit vision. There was no need for him to activate it, but there was a restriction to its range. Also, besides the aura and emotional colors, he could faintly feel the existence of everyone's soul. They were blurry, illusory, and transparent. In this state, I think I could bypass a person's body and directly attack their soul. Klein nodded thoughtfully. He circled around and prepared to test his fastest speed. Hence, he flew towards Iron Cross Street with all his strength. It didn't take long before he came to a halt and arrived outside the apartment he used to stay in. It should be about the speed of a car on the highway. It's a pity that I still can't go in and out of the spirit world. Otherwise, it'd be perfect. But if I were to be lost in the spirit world, it's said that the consequences are very severe. Just as Klein finished his self-evaluation, he felt low-spirited and gloomy. There was an unspoken pressure. He looked around and felt that Iron Cross Street was engulfed with gloominess that ordinary people could see, a darkness that the sunlight couldn't dispel. There were layers of numbness, despair, pain, and other emotions overlapping, as though they were corporeal. It feels just like what I experienced when using spiritual perception on this street when I first became a seer. Iron Cross Street's Middle Street and Lower Street hasn't changed to this day. I wonder how many years it took to accumulate such oppression and gloominess. Klein recalled the past and sighed as he flew up to the 3rd floor of the surrounding buildings. He finally felt sunlight and shook off his depression. Klein flew along Lower Street and from time to time, he would see residents who were dressed in tattered clothes, looking expressionless and malnourished. He even ran into 2 bodies that had died of natural causes. Prolonged starvation and malnutrition with a sudden infliction of an illness. There were countless people who died in agony every month. However, the bankrupt farmers and slaves that surged in from the southern continent replaced them very quickly. Klein sighed in silence and changed direction and flew south. That was the industrial area of Tianjin. The steelworks, lead factories, ceramic factories, printing factories, metalworks factories, machine construction factories, and other factories all built right next to one another. As he flew, Klein saw towering chimneys. He saw dust filling the air and a thick gloominess that was only slightly better than that of Lower Street. It was crowded with emotions of exhaustion, pain, pessimism, and numbness. Laborers who were in their 30s were considered the minority. Just as Klein wanted to fly lower to look at the area more closely, he suddenly felt weak. It was a weakness that came from inside him. My spirituality can't withstand the duress. Klein became alarmed. He was in a hurry to return home, but he suddenly thought of a better possibility. I was summoned out. If I were to end the summon, I would return naturally. He calmed down and carefully felt the surrounding environment and his status. Unsurprisingly, he discovered something that was connected to him from infinitely far away but also infinitely close to him. It formed an intricate tether to him. Through this connection, Klein clenched the flaring sun charm tightly and willed the strong desire to end the summoning. A massive and terrifying suction force overwhelmed him as his figure went from transparent to nearly invisible, and in a flash, he vanished from the corporeal world. Silence was everywhere in the boundless gray fog, and there were illusory crimson stars that twinkled. Klein reappeared in the lofty palace that looked like the home of a giant, as he sat in the seat of honor at the ancient bronze table. The entire procedure went well. Furthermore, Klein looked at his spirit body in pleasant surprise and saw that it contained a warm and pure gold portion. The flaring sun charm. I actually brought something corporeal into the world above the gray fog. He held the charm with a smile and fiddled with it to make sure it wasn't an illusory item. Klein stood up and paced back and forth, feeling completely gratified. He thought to himself in anticipation. As expected, ingredients and items can be brought into this mysterious space. I just need to find the correct way. However, this method is quite complicated. It needs me to do quite a bit before it reaches the destination. Furthermore, if I were to be summoned by the members all the time, it would damage the fool's image. I can only do that occasionally, or after I understand it more. I can design an incantation that summons the fool's adorer, but it will similarly be directed at me. I'm not some born laborer. Why must the incantation point towards me? When the time comes, I can conjure what seems like a messenger or a more unique adorer, and let it deal with the dispatch and collection of materials. Ideas popped up one after another as Klein contemplated, but due to the limitation of his capabilities and knowledge, he couldn't put them into practice just yet. As he became even weaker, Klein didn't dare to stay any longer. He used his spirituality to envelop himself and simulate the feeling of descending. In the blink of an eye, he returned to his bedroom. He saw splendid sunlight pouring in through the gap in his curtains. He examined his body and made sure that the flaring sun charm wasn't brought back but left above the gray fog. When I've gotten enough rest, I'll repeat the summoning ritual at dawn to bring the flaring sun charm back to reality. Sigh, it would be great if I could maintain the state a little longer. That way, I would be able to investigate the houses with red chimneys. It's such a pity that I can't do it yet. I could only fly long enough to investigate a few houses before having to return above the gray fog and rest for half a day. The efficiency would be just as low. Klein walked before his desk and put out the silent burning candle. After he packed his things, he didn't remove the wall of spirituality immediately. Instead, he sat down and took out a pen and paper to write a letter. A letter to Mr. Azek. After he wrote the salutation of Dear Sir, he pondered for a few minutes before penning. I recently received news that one of the 7 pirate admirals, Rear Admiral Hurricane, Kalangos, has infiltrated Backland. He carries a mystical item called the Creeping Hunger. It provides an ability similar to a shepherd, which is a sequence 5 Beyonder that swallows different souls and obtains their corresponding powers. It's said that there is a limit to the number of souls that one can let out to graze, but the souls can be swapped out. Kalango seems to have many Beyonder powers, and I'm not sure what he's trying to do in Backland. The news I received suggested that he might be after a very important, very mystical item that could make Kalangos a high-sequence Beyonder or as powerful as a high-sequence Beyonder. Klein fabricated his source of information to generally describe the situation with Kalangos, but it wasn't like Mr. Azek would look for a Nighthawk captain to confirm it. Klein didn't directly request assistance but made it seem like he brought up the subject casually to encourage Azek to be careful. Regardless of whether Mr. Azek was willing to help, it wouldn't hurt to first lay the foundations. If Klein eventually needed to ask for help, it wouldn't appear out of the blue that way. Klein let out a breath slowly and started writing the main content of the letter. The mastermind behind all that has happened hasn't taken any further action, and I still haven't found any related clues. The reason why I'm contacting you so suddenly is mainly to ask for your guidance regarding sacrificial rituals. I came across something like that during a recent mission. With the son's description and Mr. Azek's answer to compare, I should be able to try a sacrificial ritual after that. By reversing the ritual, I should be able to bestow items. This would be a more suitable ritual for exchanging ingredients and items rather than summoning myself. Yes, let's hope that Mr. Azek remembers the knowledge about this. Klein nodded slightly. He put down his pen without signing his name. There's only one copper whistle, so I'm sure Mr. Azek wouldn't make a mistake with the sender. Therefore, to be careful, Klein didn't leave his name. After he folded the letter, he looked at his 3-meter-tall ceiling. He picked up the copper whistle from the bed a little hesitantly. Perfect, let it squat and get the letter. Klein emphasized inwardly before lifting his right hand and putting the copper whistle to his lips. He puffed up his cheeks and blew hard. The whistle didn't produce a sound, but Klein's acute senses noticed that the surroundings had instantly turned cold. He activated his spirit vision and saw that there were blurry yet glistening white bones surging out of his study desk like a fountain as it rose in height. The white bones quickly gathered together and turned into an illusory yet huge monster. Its head tore through the wall of spirituality and reached somewhere unknown. Klein looked at the white skeleton's thighs and body, as well as its arm that hung down. Seeing its right palm open up, the corner of Klein's lips twitched as he tossed over the folded letter. The large bony palm did a sweep and caught the letter firmly. Then, Klein picked up his copper whistle and blew again without hesitation. The monster crumbled in an instant, transforming into bones that fell onto his desk before sinking in and vanishing. After doing all of that, Klein removed the wall of spirituality. In the sudden wind that stirred, he hobbled towards the clothes rack and returned the copper whistle to its original place. Then, he quickly walked to his bed and planted his head into it. The moment his body touched the soft mattress, he fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 183. A lesson on mediumship. After dinner, Klein engaged in small talk before reclining on the sofa. He picked up the recently delivered Awa Evening News and started leisurely reading. Benson wore a bitter expression as he sat opposite his sister. In front of him was the dining table which had been wiped clean by Bella. On it was grammar books, classic literature, accountancy notes, and other materials. In front of Melissa were her notes and stationery, including but not limited to pens, paper, rulers, compasses, etc. It's like I've been taken some 10 years back. Back then, I was still a student at the church's Sunday school, Benson complained, but he continued to study with his head down. That's not too bad. This scene makes me feel the achievement of being a parent. Klein smiled and said, knowledge can change one's destiny, and diligence will result in glory. I made up the latter half of that saying. I wonder if Roselle has said that before. He lampooned in his heart. The room quickly became quiet except for the sound of pens scratching across pages or of books being flipped. Bella had finished doing the dishes and tidied up the kitchen before returning to her room on the first floor. A small room that was formerly the guest room. Klein sipped on his Psy black tea as he read the newspaper, occasionally engaging in small talk with his siblings. It was relaxing. Suddenly, the gas lamps in the living room and dining room turned dark at the same time as if they had run out of fuel. Benson and Melissa looked up towards the lamps, in an attempt to figure out the cause. Klein also looked towards the lamps. At this moment, he felt something touch his arm. He was the only living person in the living room, but something had touched his arm.
His hair stood on end.
Klein retracted his arm and turned to look over. He saw 5 thin, pale fingers growing on the tip of a tongue. Underneath them was an irregular row of sharp teeth. Klein instinctively reached for his pockets. Within them were the requiem charms and slumber charms. But he caught a glimpse of a neatly folded piece of paper in the finger's grasp.
A letter. A messenger. Klein heaved a sigh of relief.
At that moment, the 5 pale fingers prodded his arm again.
Klein saw Melissa about to stand up and check on the gas lamp.
He reached out with his left hand and grabbed the letter. Then he quickly retracted his arm and hid the letter under the stack of newspapers on the table. He then saw the fingers, tongue, and the irregular row of sharp teeth fade away and disappear from the corner of his eyes.
With a thought, Klein tapped his left molar and silently activated his spirit vision.
He once again saw the 5 abnormally thin fingers.
He saw the long red tongue adorned with sharp, white teeth. He saw them retracting back into the transparent face on the ground. A second later, the face disappeared completely. The lights in the living room and dining room were restored back to normal.
Strange, Melissa pouted, finding no faults with the lamps even after a serious check. Why is the lady in our house responsible for such things, while the men watch from the side?
Klein shook his head and deactivated his spirit vision. When spirits were willing to be seen and had the corresponding abilities, even an ordinary person could spot them.
What happened just now was an example.
After discussing the problem with the gas lamps, the Moretti siblings became quiet once again. Benson and Melissa once again delved into the ocean of knowledge.
Klein used the newspaper as a cover and unfolded the letter with one hand. He placed the paper between the newspapers and started reading the reply from Spirit Guide Daily.
I have to emphasize again, I prefer the title of Spirit Medium. I'm going to give you a positive response regarding what you asked. Yes, mediumship rituals can also be used on living beings, not just living humans. But this is troublesome and poses some level of danger. The souls left behind by the dead are pure. They have few impurities or chaotic thoughts. We can communicate with them, asking them questions and receiving answers without any barriers. Of course, you can use the method of dream divination to directly receive images from them. But that cannot be replicated with living humans. The subject still has a will and would fight against unprotected communication between souls.
Klein's lips twitched when he read the letter.
He confirmed that it was Daly herself who wrote this letter. Unprotected communication. That really is the way she speaks. Klein returned to the letter after taking a quick glance at his siblings. We only have 2 methods when faced with such a situation. First, we can use our powerful spirituality and sophisticated mediumship rituals to triumph over the will of the other person, engaging in a barbaric method of communication. Second, we can use medication to make the other party relax. What I use the most are the Amantha Essence and Eye of the Spirit medication. Heh, I'm sure that you still have a lingering impression of those. After reaching the stage of channeling the soul, you must take note that you're also in a spiritual state, unlike when you're communicating with the souls left behind by the dead. In simpler terms, your spirituality is entering the spirituality world of the other party. Take note, a professional spirit medium wouldn't lack the means of protecting themselves under such a state. But you cannot do that. You would not be able to learn or use the techniques that I know of even if I explained them to you. So you have to maintain a certain level of lucidity and rational thought. Only through this method can you fight back against the torrents of the other party's random and chaotic thoughts before arriving before his spirit and establishing communication. At this point, you'll be communicating at the level of the body of heart and mind. At this stage, you have 2 options.
One is to use a technique to forcefully read the memories of the other party, but you have to be very careful, for you cannot be sure if the things you're reading are the things that you want to know.
If you indiscriminately receive a large amount of memories from a person, it's very likely that your soul would collapse. Furthermore, it will cause severe damage to your target soul, sometimes even destroying them completely. Unless you're a professional spirit medium, I do not suggest using this method. The second option is to gently communicate with the other party's body of heart and mind. No matter how you entered, whether it be through violence or medication, the target will definitely be in a groggy state. They would generally not be able to lie, just like you couldn't. No, you cannot recall what happened to you. Although I know you've definitely forgotten about it. Sorry, Madam Daly. I was very awake back then.
Klein chortled inwardly as he lowered his gaze and read the rest of the letter.
Such communication can allow you to obtain real answers, but they won't necessarily all be the truth. You should understand what I mean.
As long as you read the news, you must have heard Emperor Roselle's famous quote. I don't remember the actual quote, but the essence of the quote is that what one says shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. In short, a spirit might not remember everything because a lot of memories are in one's subconscious or collectively be in the subconscious. Oh, I shouldn't mention that. Dunn calls it the evil theories of the psychology alchemists. Thus, you must be able to guide the soul and be good at designing your questions. Do you understand? The corresponding techniques include. These are all under normal circumstances. What should we pay attention to when we're trying to communicate with the soul of a beyonder who has gone insane? It's the same. Maintaining your lucidity. You must not fall into a daze at all. This is because a beyonder's spirituality is very potent and their spirit is filled with chaotic thoughts. Let me give an example. An ordinary person's consciousness is an island. The subconscious is the portion of the sea beneath the island. The collective subconscious is the surrounding sea. The sky belongs to the spirit world. As for a beyonder, his island might have a controllable active volcano. A lunatic's island might have a volcano that can erupt at any time. It would quake the foundations and pollute the sea. When you come into unprotected contact with the spirit of an insane person, his chaotic thoughts might infect you. Just like how polluted water in the sea would flow outward, spreading further. Yes, channeling his spirit under such conditions is like linking your seed to his. Thus, you need to pay close attention to this pollution. A few examples are when a spirit medium is careless when doing similar things and didn't use any protection. After that, they can develop mental problems similar to that of the target. Under normal circumstances, mental diseases are not contagious. But in the domain of mysticism, in the world of channeling spirits, they can indeed be contagious. Maintaining your lucidity and not being affected by the chaotic thoughts of the target are things that you must pay attention to. Following those would be the guided questions, which can be used to effectively communicate with an insane person. If you wish to try this, I suggest applying a sedative agent before doing so. The corresponding formula is available behind Tinjin City's Chinese Gate. There's also the formulated product. It can be effective in helping you maintain rational thought during the process. Of course, you can also get Dunn to apply for help from the Baklund Diocese. I'm very willing to see the spirituality state of an insane Sequence 7 psychiatrist. Lucidity and rational thought. That's my expertise. I maintained lucidity and rational thought even when my soul was being channeled. Of course, I'm not someone who lets confidence get to my head. I'll still apply for the sedative agent, amantha extract, and eye of the spirit medication. Klein heaved a sigh of relief, a little eager to make the attempt. He put down his newspaper and stood up. He then entered the bathroom and ignited the letter with his spirituality before tossing the ashes into the toilet bowl and flushing them. That night, Klein once again tried the ritual for summoning himself and brought the flaring sun charm back to the physical world and into his room. He also didn't receive Mr. Azek's letter, even though he had expected a swift reply. Perhaps he needed some time to recall the knowledge. Or perhaps, he's not free to give a reply for now. Or perhaps he's worried that he would interrupt my sleep. Klein dispelled the wall of spirituality as he speculated. He made his way to the bed. The following day, Tuesday morning, Klein entered the Blackthorn Security Company and knocked on the door to the captain's office as usual. Chapter 184. Behind the gate, please come in, Dunn Smith said with a mellow and pleasant voice. Klein turned the doorknob and pushed open the door to see the captain having his breakfast. In his right hand was a cup of coffee emitting a rich aroma. On the plate in front of him, there was white bread toast and bacon. Dunn placed the remaining sandwich toast with butter into his mouth and ate it. He then silently pointed to the chair opposite his desk. Klein didn't disturb his captain from enjoying his breakfast. With a smile, he sat down as he waited patiently. Dunn saw that he was in no hurry, so he relaxed back into his chair, picked up his coffee to take a sip, and swallowed the food in his mouth. He took a napkin, wiped the corners of his lips and said, "What's the matter?" Klein nodded seriously and said, "I've met Daxter Guderian, the doctor at the asylum and also member of the psychology alchemists." As he spoke, he caught a glimpse of the magazine that was spread open before the captain. "Did he provide any news?" Dunn asked, crossing his arms. Klein simply described, "He told me that before Hood Eugen went crazy, there was someone who visited him quite frequently. That person's name is Lenevis." Lenevis. Dunn massaged his temples. "I seem to have heard of it before.
He's the cheat who swindled at least £10,000, Klein reminded him.
Dunn thought for a while with a serious look on his face. He then shook his head to show that he had no memory of it.
Captain, you're not sensitive at all when it comes to money. Klein lampooned and told him the related story about Lenivus by highlighting the main points. The cheat falsely claimed that he had prospected and purchased an iron mine with rich deposits of iron ore. He raised funds from private individuals in Tingen and swindled more than £10,000. Someone I know from the divination club suffered a loss from this. In addition, a young woman was swindled into an engagement with him and is now pregnant with his child. He visited Hood Eugen multiple times before he went crazy, Dunn said in thought. Sequence 8 Beyonder, Swindler? The Marauder Pathway. Captain, your memory is actually good when it comes to this kind of thing. Klein found it funny as he reflected over it. He nodded faintly and said, that was my guess as well. Because the steelworks company that Lenivus set up was in the south and the victims were of several different beliefs, the case wasn't passed to us in the end. Even if there had been evidence of Beyonder involvement in the case, it would have been passed over to the mandated punishers.
Dunn finally understood the ins and outs of the story. He looked at Klein with his deep gray eyes and said, what do you want to do?
Cough, Captain. Can you please not be so sensitive?
Klein replied with a mask of solemnity. I want to talk to Hood Eugen via mediumship ritual and figure out why Lenivus came looking for him.
I want to know if that visit is directly related to him going insane.
Dunn nodded slightly and said, even if you hadn't applied to do it, I would have had a similar experiment done when we were certain that Hood Eugen is crazy.
However, Daly told me that it's quite risky. Are you confident? I can ask for assistance from the Backlund diocese. It shouldn't be a problem to delay it for a few days.
Klein's main motivation to become a Beyonder was to study mysticism and find a way home. As it was a chance for practical exercise and he was confident enough, he was naturally unwilling to give it up. Captain, I've mastered knowledge on the subject.
I'm confident about this.
Of course, I'll require certain ingredients, such as the amantha extract, eye of the spirit medicine, and sedative agent. Sedative agent. Dunn ruminated over the name and confirmed Klein's professionalism. He remembered Daly mentioned that it was a liquid medicine that was rarely used yet was very efficient in mediumship. Dunn Smith pondered for nearly 20 seconds and leaned back into his chair.
He said, go ahead and fill out a request form. Then, collect what you need from behind Cheney's gate. I'm not sure if there are any finished goods. If there aren't any, pick up the ingredients you need and concoct the medicine accordingly.
All right, Klein replied happily. He didn't get up but sat firmly in his chair.
Dunn massaged his temples.
He thought carefully and said, it happens to be my turn to monitor the asylum this evening.
We can't visit Hood Eugen directly.
No one knows if there are members of the psychology alchemists disguised as doctors, nurses, janitors, or patients in the asylum. No one knows if the psychology alchemists are monitoring Hood Organ either.
Any action we take must be secret.
We can't expose that Dax Terguderian has become our informant.
We'll go at dawn by sneaking in secretly.
Yes, I'll keep guard while you perform the ritual to prevent any accidents from happening.
That'd be best.
If Hood Eugen is just pretending to be crazy, while I use a mediumship ritual on him, it would be like I barged into the zoo and danced before a tiger. Klein relaxed and said sincerely, yes, Captain.
He stood up and walked towards the door.
Just then, the corner of his eyes noticed the title of the magazine article the captain was reading. Donningsman tree sap in the southern continent's rainforests has had a significant effect on boosting hair growth.
Klein retracted his gaze, opened the door, and exited the captain's office. Suddenly, there was a playful thought that flashed through his mind. Actually, a Beyonder doesn't need to go through such trouble. If old Neil was still around, he could design a ritualistic magic for hair regrowth.
Then, he would pray for the goddess's assistance. Whether one would be covered with hair and become a curly-haired baboon, that's another story.
What would the goddess's response be?
If it were me, I would definitely curse. Motherfucker. That thought suddenly tainted Klein's happiness with sadness, but there was also a hint of hilarity in the sadness. He entered the clerk's office and sat before the Ackerson Model 1346 typewriter and finished typing his application. After Dunn Smith stamped and signed the application, he took it down to the basement and walked along the tunnel that was lit up with gas lamps, towards Cheney's gate. Only at that moment did Klein realize something. It would be the first time that he was going beyond the mysterious gate. I wonder what it looks like. He quickened his pace with anticipation and came before the twin doors of the black gate. He first passed his request to Xueqi, who was on duty that day for registration purposes. Then, Klein took back the document that now had her signature as well. He knocked on Cheney's gate and sensed how empty and distant the echo was. He didn't hear any footsteps, but within half a minute, the gate with 7 dark sacred emblems opened with a creak. Cheney's gate opened up to allow a single person's passage before coming to a stop. Klein then walked in with the help of the gas lamps on both sides of the corridor. Behind the gate, there was an elderly man with obvious wrinkles and thinning hair. He was wearing a classic black robe and holding a barn lantern. The dim candlelight shone through the glass, illuminating the elderly man's expressionless face, which was a mixture of light and darkness. His light blue eyes were like ice that had been frozen for 1,000 years. "Document," he said with his husky voice. Klein had seen the elderly man before because at dusk every day, he would come out from behind Cheney's gate with his partners. They would pass by the duty room and take the hallway leading to St. Selena Cathedral. They were nighthawks who had aged and volunteered to keep guard inside. According to Klein's understanding, there were 5 of them who were keeping watch. "This is my application." He passed the document in his hands to the elderly man before him. The guard with light blue eyes raised the barn lantern and looked through the request carefully. After he made sure that there were no mistakes, he moved aside and let Klein pass. Klein passed through Cheney's gate slowly. He had yet to take a good look around when he felt an indescribably chill. It wasn't the cold of winter, but a chill that would make a human spirituality shiver. Klein lifted his gaze and looked afar. He saw candlesticks appearing on the wall in succession, and there were silver candles with carvings on them. The flames gave out a blue luster, without any flickering. Creak. The guard closed Cheney's gate, and the surroundings became extremely quiet. There was a broad walkway before Klein, a walkway paved with ancient stone slabs. On both sides of the walkway were stone doors labeled ingredients, medicine, information, and so on. At the end of the walkway, there was a flight of stairs that connected to the lower floors. It extended into the dark as though it was connected to the abyss. It should be connected to different sealed locations that have sealed artifacts. I heard that there are a few floors. I wonder which floor contains St. Selena's ashes? Klein adapted to the brightness behind the gate and suddenly felt that there was something shapeless scraping against his skin. They were in strips, and every one of them chilled him to the bones. He shivered, and he couldn't help but activate his spirit vision. Then, he looked at the entire area behind Cheney's gate. It was filled with fine black lines. They were swaying lightly, occasionally clustered together, occasionally extended. They were tightly knitted without any gaps. This is the sealing power behind Cheney's gate? Klein nodded indiscernibly. He reined in his thoughts and followed the guard. They went through a heavy stone door labeled medicine room. Very soon, he found the amantha extract, the eye of the spirit medicine, and the sedative agent by following the alphabet labels. He had seen the first 2 before, but it was his first time picking up the latter one. He saw that a blue fluid rippled in the translucent glass bottle. For some reason, looking at the fluid made him feel as though he had entered a mother's embrace. On the bottle, there was a label. It showed the manufacturing date and the expiration date, which was still some time away. Luckily, it can still be used. Klein took the 3 tiny bottles of medicine and walked back to Cheney's gate with the guard keeping him company. He shook off the feeling of coldness that reached the deepest corner of his soul, and the creepy experience of being swept by the black lines. When Cheney's gate closed, he couldn't help but look back. He mumbled to himself, staying in there for a long time would affect both the body and soul, right? It's no wonder the guards have to volunteer. Around dawn, Klein used a special technique to lock his bedroom. He pushed open his oriel window and jumped down. The 2-story height posed no danger to the present him. He landed steadily without faltering at all. The Nighthawk's carriage was already parked opposite, waiting for him. Without any exchange, Klein quickly arrived at Tingen Asylum in the North Borough. Following the captain's instructions, he took a detour to one of the corners without a street lamp where he saw the waiting Dunn Smith. "Let's go in." Dunn nodded faintly. "I've made sure that there's no one around." "All right." Klein quickly got closer. As a clown, entering an asylum, it keeps reminding me of a famous saying. It's like returning home, he mused to himself. He followed Dunn closely. With the aid of the wall's bumpy surface, They somersaulted into the asylum quickly and agilely without standing balance. Dunn turned around and looked. He nodded slightly to give his approval. The two of them crouched and silently moved through the hospital's small park and activity square. They then entered the 3-story building in the asylum and arrived at the top floor where Hood Eugen's room was. As Hood Eugen had the possibility of becoming violent now that he had gone insane, he had been assigned to a single room. Luckily, the monitoring Nighthawks hadn't wasted their efforts during the surveillance and had made a copy of the room key long ago. Gotcha! The lock clicked lightly, and Dunn entered first. Klein projected his gaze past his figure and saw the person sitting on the bed. Hood Eugen's face was long and skinny. His eye sockets were deeply concave and his blonde hair was disheveled. He was looking at the metal-barred window with his grayish-blue eyes. He was looking at the crimson moon outside. Klein closed the door to the room and chuckled as he casually asked, "Why aren't you sleeping?" Dunn was taken aback and suddenly remembered that Klein was now a Sequence 8 clown. Hence, he remained silent and backed off to a corner of the room. Hood Eugen turned his head and looked at Klein. He chuckled foolishly and replied, "I'm waiting for my cake." Chapter 185. Spiritual World Waiting for Cake? That really wasn't an answer that I was expecting. Of course, if I was able to anticipate the answer of a mental patient, wouldn't that mean that I was almost there myself? The thought flashed through Klein's mind. He maintained his relaxed smile as if he was chatting with a friend. "Who's going to send you a cake?" Hood Eugen's expression fell instantly, his face long and depressed. "No, there's no cake. There's no cake. You stole my cake." His voice suddenly became shrill as he glared angrily at Klein. Without waiting for Klein to speak, he let out a shout and opened his mouth, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. Following which, he leaped from his mattress while salivating. He closed in on Klein with one step and extended his hands, attempting to grab onto Klein's shoulders. He wanted to drag Klein towards him and bite him. Despite the sudden attack, Klein reacted quickly despite appearing a little flustered. He instantly bent his knee and squatted. At the same time, he tilted his body to the side and raised his left arm. Oof! His shoulder slammed into Hood Eugen's abdomen, causing Hood's eyes to turn white and drool to drip from his mouth. But Hood Eugen didn't stop moving. He allowed the momentum to carry him down as he opened his arms in an attempt to pull Klein into a bear hug. Klein tilted his body to the side and rolled over. His movements were smooth as though he had practiced them hundreds of times. He pushed against the ground with his right hand and stood up with a somersault. He decided to go on the offensive and charged forward to restrain his opponent. But at that moment, Hood Eugen only stood there blankly, his eyes losing focus, becoming vacant and lost. Klein froze for a moment. He turned his head towards the corner of the room, only to see Dunn Smith, wearing a black windbreaker and matching hat, with his hands clasped tightly together and looking down. The captain has dragged Hood Eugen into a dream. Upon realizing this, he stopped his subsequent attack and took the opportunity to take out the silver ritual dagger that couldn't harm anyone. He used it to create a wall of spirituality which sealed the ward. Klein then took out 3 candles infused with mint and placed them on the window in a triangular formation. One candle signified the Evernight goddess, another the Mother of the Secrets, and the last represented himself. Soon after, he set up a simple altar and used his spirituality to ignite the candles. Just as he was about to warn the captain, Dunn raised his head and smiled. Hood Eugen's dreams are a sea of chaos. There's no way to guide it. Just as he finished his sentence, a luster returned to Hood Eugen's eyes. It was no longer vacant. Then, the insane psychiatrist moved his waist, letting out a comfortable yawn. Klein was momentarily at a loss, so he remained quiet. He picked up a metal bottle containing the amantha extract. He dripped the transparent liquid extracted from the night vanilla, slumber flower, and chamomile into the flames of the candle representing himself, allowing the serene aroma to spread around the room. Hood Eugen's nervousness, anger, and relief completely vanished. He languidly sat down again on the edge of his bed and looked out at the crimson moon outside the window in a daze. His eyes once again lost their focus as peace was restored. Klein also felt the peace that came with the night. He set the amantha extract down and sat beside Hood Eugen. He wanted to find something to break down Hood's last line of defense. Only with the removal of the last line of defense could he use the Eye of the Spirit medication to make Hood Eugen's soul slip into a turbid state. After all, I'm not a professional spirit medium. He had already thought of an idea before coming.
He fished out a set of tarot cards from his pocket. This set of cards only had the 22 major arcana, so it was easy to carry around. It was a weapon that Klein had successfully applied for. Each of the cards was lined with metal threads made from pure silver. Each of them was able to kill undead beings. Their patterns were complicated and gorgeous, making Klein feel like they were a collector's item and not used against enemies. Klein cut the deck with one hand and smiled at Hood Eugen. "Let's play some card games." "Cards?" Hood Eugen retracted his gaze from outside the window as he repeated the term in a daze. Klein didn't answer, placing the deck of tarot cards into Hood's palm with a sincerity that could not be rejected. Hood Eugen mimicked Klein's actions, trying his hardest to cut the deck with one hand to some success. The attention of the mental patient was slowly drawn to the hard yet flexible, beautifully textured cards in his hand. He flipped over the first card. It was the picture of a man in tattered clothes with his hands tied. He was hanging by his leg with a faint halo at his head. The Hanged Man. Klein nodded in thought. He took the opportunity to grab the eye of the spirit medicine, dripping the amber liquid onto the candle flame, still the one representing himself. An alcoholic fragrance spread forth, inducing an intoxicated feeling to anyone who took a whiff of it. Hood Eugen spaced out bit by bit, his vision losing its focus. The deck of tarot cards in his hand fell onto the bed. But he remained sitting upright, without slumping over. Klein used cogitation to fight back against the medicine's dreamy effects of turning light-headed and ethereal. He took out another metal bottle from his pocket and twisted the cap open before pouring the blue liquid into his mouth. Sedative agent. The ice-cold liquid flowed through his throat, down his gullet, and into his stomach. Klein instantly felt unusually awake, without any sense of drowsiness. He slowly exhaled, then familiarly took out the other essential oil extracts and herb powders, dripping them onto the 2 candles signifying the Evernight goddess. In the faint fog, he took 2 steps back and solemnly murmured in Hermes, "I pray for the power of the dark night. I pray for the power of the mystery. I pray for the goddess's loving grace. I pray that you would allow me to communicate with the spirituality of the beyond beside me." Hood Eugen. The incantations reverberated around the room, and Klein saw the flames of the candle, now dyed black, spread outward. He didn't avoid them, nor did he guard against them. He allowed the dark night to envelop him. In this unusually lucid state, he felt his spirit leave the protection of his body and enter a space akin to deep space. All around him was boundless, silent darkness. The sky above him was filled with countless indescribable, transparent figures. There were also streaks of different colors, lustrous splendors that harbored infinite knowledge. The spiritual world. Klein was no longer a stranger to this. Just as he had this thought, a foggy world appeared before him. It was a world enveloped by a faint tornado of light. Klein knew that it represented Hood Eugen's spirit that represented his body of heart and mind. Thus, he leaned over, digging into the wall that was the tornado. In an instant, he saw countless specks of light pelting him. He heard the voices of thousands of people discussing something in whispers. These murmurings were very chaotic and lacked any sense of logic. Some included praises for the elegance of some lady, then it turned into a description of the feeling of relief after using the toilet. Some started as a weep, then turned into frenzied joy. The insane thoughts latched on and gnawed at Klein's spirit in a bid to assimilate him. But Klein maintained his lucidity and rationality, quickly flying towards Hood Eugen's spiritual world. "This is like a pleasant concert compared to the horrifying murmurings and howls I hear when entering the world above the gray fog." Klein smiled secretly and made his way through the tornado. He saw a groggy, translucent Hood Eugen. This sequence 7 psychiatrist maintained the same state as he was in the outside world. He looked over with a dazed expression. Klein stopped before him and asked softly, "Do you know Lenivus?" Hood Eugen replied blankly yes. The light around them underwent a transformation as if Hood Eugen was revealing his spiritual sea. Quickly, the intertwining light revealed a bespectacled average-looking man who wore a sarcastic smile. It was the same Lenivus whom Klein had seen in the arrest warrants. Klein nodded in satisfaction and collected himself. He asked a guided question. "Why did Lenivus look for you?" He said. Hood Eugen's voice slowly turned soft. Suddenly, he changed into a more charismatic voice and laughed a little maniacally. "Hood Eugen, this is the worst era, but also the best era. As long as you seize the opportunity, we can become the rulers of this world, we can become true immortals. As long as you're willing to help,
I'll not only tell you the way to master your potion and avoid losing control, I'll also promise that you'll receive godhood qualities in the future. Immortal godhood qualities. You should be able to see the presence behind me. My promise is his promise. In some sense, the psychology alchemists are connected to him. Do not doubt. The psychology alchemists aren't strong enough at the moment. It is unable to provide you with enough help unless you're willing to stay at this level for the rest of your life. The method to grasp your potion without losing control. Why does this sound like how I entice others with the acting method? Lenivus sure has lofty ambitions. He's only a sequence 8, yet he's already talking about manipulating godhood qualities. Just what hidden presence is backing him? This guy seems to be plotting something, which isn't solely just to cheat people out of their money. Or could running scams just be his hobby? Klein had many thoughts as he listened on. When Hood Eugen stopped talking, he quickly pressed on. What kind of assistance did Lenivus want you to provide? Hood Eugen didn't answer immediately. His spiritual world turned silent. He then broke out into laughter. He replied erratically, help, help, help. Ha ha ha, I provided help. I provided help. I made. His words came to an abrupt halt as his blurry soul contorted. The light and darkness of the surroundings which represented the spiritual sea quickly turned incorporeal, forming a sinister, scary, dark altar. On top of the altar was a cross. There seemed to be something hanging on the cross, as well as things that appeared indiscernible piled at the bottom. The light and darkness alternated, and as the hanging item was about to become clearer, the entire spiritual world shook, as if it was experiencing a magnitude 10 earthquake. Holy shit! Klein had a premonition that something dangerous was about to happen. Without thinking, he turned and flew towards the chaotic tornado of thoughts in an attempt to escape. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.